1 minute.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is now time for another edition of the most disruptive show covering news and events across those states, as well as across our divided globe. And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Going straight into the headlines this morning. First up in COVID news, Britain has become the first country in the West to approve a COVID-19 vaccine for public use. The UK Department of Health and Social Care confirmed in a statement to British news agencies that the vaccine developed jointly by American agencies, by American drug maker Pfizer and Germany's BioNTech would be distributed starting next week. Pfizer was the first of three major Western pharmaceutical companies to apply in both the US and Europe for emergency use authorization. In line with planning in the U.S., British frontline healthcare workers, care home residents, the very elderly, and people with underlying conditions that make them particularly vulnerable to COVID-19 complications are expected to get the first doses of the vaccine. Pfizer's vaccine, like the Oxford and Moderna formulas, requires 2 doses about a month apart. And as if you can trust Dr. Anthony Fauci back in the States, we should be seeing that released to the wider public in the U.S. around April. I mean, rolled out progressively in different tiers to the most vulnerable before then, but then more widely available if you want to get it. And I just want to come back to this is yesterday's headline, but very briefly, Jamarl. Dr. Fauci, in the bits that we were quoting yesterday, at the very least, seemed to be stressing that it would be completely voluntary. Like he mentioned that a couple of times. Did you by any chance notice that?
I didn't necessarily notice it. To be honest, I wasn't entirely paying attention to that particular speech. But I look, every time I have seen Fauci mention vaccines, he's always said voluntary. I've never heard him say that they were going to be forced upon the population, especially not in the United States.
Yeah.
But I haven't heard him recently.
A lot of people are concerned about either their kids forcefully being, necessarily being given vaccines if they want to go into schools that require them to have them, or if you're like a traveler, and like we were talking about the other day, if every airline requires you to have a vaccine, for instance, then for all travelers, that's effectively a mandate. So I get that concern. That's separate from the government doing its thing, but just throwing it in, just sort of noting this stuff as it comes.
Yeah, I don't want to be forced to get a vaccine either.
Yeah.
I mean, let's be very honest. There's a financial incentive in the vaccine market. Every year, you have these drug companies that put out these vaccines. You have them at with the drug stores and everything else. And you don't even know if they work because they're giving you a virus for something that was last season. And so it's like, wait, you can't tell me if this is going to work. Nope. But, hey, you get some level of coverage, right? And so, I get if we're talking about smallpox. I get if we're talking about something major. But I don't necessarily want to be forced to get some new vaccine that these guys came up with in a very short span of time. I would rather social distance, if I'm being honest, and see how that play out. Those people, when they don't turn into zombies in a year, then I'll try it. But I don't want to be forced. So that would be a fail for me.
Fair enough. Fair enough. All right. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is reducing the number of days one should quarantine after being exposed to the coronavirus from 14 days to about 7 to 10 days. This has been expected for almost a week now. Dr. Robert Redfield, director of the CDC, made the announcement during a coronavirus task force meeting on Tuesday. Redfield informed Vice President Mike Pence and the White House Coronavirus Task Force that the CDC will be issuing new orders on the number of days that a person who has been in direct contact with COVID-19 virus should quarantine soon. New guidelines recommend that someone who has been exposed or had close contact with the virus should quarantine for 7 to 10 days, which is less than the originally recommended 14 days. According to the new guidelines, the individual can end their quarantine after 7 days with a negative COVID-19 test or 10 days without a test. And looking into this a little bit, it seems like the reason that they're doing this is not that people aren't technically still able to spread the sickness in that last 10 to 14 day period, in that last interval that they're sort of not officially recommending at this point. It's just that their thinking, it seems, is that most people wouldn't have followed those guidelines. They were too stringent. In other words, it's easier to ask people to do a 7 to 10 day quarantine than a 14-day quarantine, even though there's technically some chance that they're going to spread it in those last 4 to 7 days, really those last 4 days if they get the negative on the test. It's a lot of people wouldn't follow those guidelines anyway, and so it's better to ask them for less and have a higher credence that they're going to do it than to ask them for more and think that a bunch of people are not going to do it because it's too stringent. Anywho, President Trump tweeted late Tuesday that he will veto the National Defense Authorization Act unless Congress repeals Section 230 of the 1996 Communications Decency Act, which critics say unfairly shields social media platforms from liability over items posted on their platforms. These opponents have been vocal that tech behemoths like Twitter and Facebook should no longer be shielded as a neutral platform when they operate more like a publisher, editorializing and suppressing certain stories, etc. The criticism seemed to reach its tipping point during the Hunter Biden scandal in the weeks prior to the presidential election. At that point, the New York Post ran an explosive report, really series of reports, that showed emails from Hunter Biden linking his father to his Ukraine business dealings and other media of Hunter Biden's showing illicit behavior by the president-elect's son. Republican Senators Ted Cruz, Lindsey Graham, and Josh Hawley called on the heads of Twitter and Facebook at the time to testify, and they did. They were called forward. There was a hearing, and Republicans didn't really ever ask them about Section 230. They just sort of harangued them. Not that anybody was, frankly, a lot of folks who listen to the show, and myself included, I didn't really particularly mind that. I was pretty frustrated with what Twitter and Facebook were doing and are doing with this stuff. So they could definitely do with a haranguing. But there are deeper questions, of course, about what repealing Section 230 would do, what that would open up, how that would affect the shape of the internet. But that is the sort of bulwark letting the social media giants, I'll just use that word again, letting them do what they're doing. Jamarl, do you have any take on this before we move on to other headlines?
It's
on that dynamic.
There's something really fascinating about this. If you ever think about it, when Democrats, Hillary Clinton loses, and what do Democrats do? They bring the tech companies and they give them a tongue lashing, and they get Cambridge Analytica and they say, here's the reason Hillary Clinton lost because of this data stuff. And there was the Russians that Facebook and Twitter ads. Their ire and their attacks were basically on social media and making social media basically more censorship. Donald Trump loses the election. What does Donald Trump do? He issues his focus and attention on social media in a very similar way.
Well, here's the thing.
Fascinating.
They're both attacking the same, they're both attacking the same entities, but for opposite reasons, and they're asking them to do opposite things.
Yeah.
So the Democrats they want more censorship. Republicans want much less censorship. And the social media giants are caught they can't do both. There's no way for them to do both. And so they're sort of subject to the winds of politics,
That's so fascinating.
It
sucks for them, don't get me wrong, but it is fascinating.
It sucks for us. Well, I would say it sucks for us.
Oh, right. I keep acting like we're perched on the side of the world and that we're not like really in it. You know what I mean? But yeah, that's horrible. It really is.
Yeah, and I mean, especially if you think about it, just to throw this stuff in, we got to get back to the headlines here. Really, I do. But at one point, you had a sort of media that was before the internet. Just put it like this: you have the radio, you have newspapers, you have TV, etc. Increasingly, these are not just like broadcast online, but if you look at newspapers, for instance, they've moved pretty much entirely online. So these other forms of media have been subsumed by the internet, by the rise of digital media, whatever terms you want to use for it. That means that, that centralization of power in this infrastructure means that the rules that the internet's supposed to be run under increasingly affect what we're able to see. And when we talk about social media, these are literally like the technologies that mediate the interactions we have in society, just with each other, flat out, in this sort of increasingly atomized age. There aren't that many other ways for us to really interact, and especially ones that scale. Anyway, if you think about this stuff here, I'm already preaching to the choir. I'll get back to the headlines here. It just freaks me out sometimes. In our next headline, the Justice Department is investigating a bribery scheme that directed money to the White House or used political contributions in exchange for a presidential pardon. According to court documents released Tuesday, the district court in Washington, D.C. released 20 pages of heavily redacted documents that do not identify who is being investigated, nor the timing of the alleged scheme. The government's motion was initially submitted to Chief Judge Beryl A. Howell under seal in order to obtain permission to review certain attorney-client communications prosecutors believe proved potential, quote-unquote, criminal activity. A filter team working on behalf of the government was going through several terabytes of data they had seized from over 50 electronic devices, such as iPhones, iPads, laptops, thumb drives, and hard drives. Prosecutors asked floppy drives aren't on that list. Prosecutors asked the court for permission to review email communications they believed revealed a bribery conspiracy scheme in which Redacted would offer a substantial political contribution in exchange for a presidential pardon or reprieve of sentence for Redacted. Can't help but think I know what that second Redacted, whose name would fill in that blank. On Tuesday evening, after the release of the court document, an official with the Justice Department sought to tamp down speculation about who might be targeted in the probe. The official said that, quote, no government official was or is currently a subject or target of the investigation disclosed in this filing, quote, end quote. Interesting story. Want to see what comes out on the other side of it. Hope to learn more about this soon. Hope it's nothing shady, but by definition, almost, I think it is. In Ethiopian news, in a breakthrough a month after deadly conflict cut off Ethiopia's Tigray region from the world, the United Nations on Wednesday said it and the Ethiopian government have signed a deal to allow unimpeded humanitarian access. That's at least for areas under federal government control after the Prime Minister's declaration of victory over the weekend. This will allow the first food, medicines, and other aid into the region of 6 million people that has been seen rising hunger during the fighting between the federal and Tigray regional governments. Each regards the other as illegal in a power struggle that has been months in the making. For weeks, the UN and others have pleaded for access amid reports of supplies running desperately low for millions of people. UN humanitarian spokesman Saviano Abreu said the first mission to carry out a needs assessment would begin this Wednesday. That's today. In Singapore, a country has given regulatory approval for the world's first clean meat. That is a Lent-style, Lakoff-style term if I ever saw one. That is meat that does not come from slaughtered animals. The decision paves the way for San Francisco-based startup Eat Just to sell lab-grown chicken meat. The meat will initially be used in nuggets, but the company hasn't said when they will become available. Demand for alternatives to regular meat has surged due to consumer concerns about health, animal welfare, and the environment. According to Barclays, the market for meat alternatives could be worth $140 billion within the next decade, or about 10% of the $1.4 trillion global meat industry. The company called it a breakthrough for the global food industry and hopes other countries will now follow suit. Over the last decade, dozens of startups have attempted to bring cultured meat to market, hoping to win over conventional meat eaters with the promise of a more ethical product. Two of the largest are Israel-based Future Meat Technologies and the Bill Gates-backed Memphis Meats, which are both trying to enter the market with affordable and tasty lab-grown meats, quote-unquote at least. Singapore's Shiok Meats is working on lab-grown crustacean meats. While many have touted the environmental benefits, some scientists have suggested it might be worse for climate change under some circumstances. Jamarl, I've got to come to you on this one, man. What is your take on that? What's your take in general on lab-grown meats? I mean, you can have a couple of different conversations about this, whether it's nutrition, little bit more in the weeds, or about the whole animal welfare question. You can also talk about the environment, different sides of that. I'm just, in a broad sense, what's your perspective on this, man?
So as someone who's a carnivore, and was raised that way, you know what I mean? It's difficult to pull yourself out of that. It's gross to me that you grow meat in a lab. By the same token, isn't it weirder that you have to kill something, skin it, gut it, bleed it out? Isn't that also gross? And wouldn't a lab be less gross? But it doesn't feel that way, at least not from my perspective. All things being equal, I would prefer not to kill the animal to get the meat. But it feels gross to me to get meat without an animal.
How about, I'm going to close out headlines. This is going to dominate the last couple of seconds we have. You've been listening to Headlines on Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. It will dominate it, Jamarl. I heard you chuckling. No, I mean, here's the thing, man. What about like the whole, okay, so you can level it just from the animal welfare perspective. You're bringing up the moral dynamic there in terms of how weird it is for us to actually like kill and blood these creatures, and just the fact that we've historically done that we've gotten used to it, the churn of nature. But what if it's not like a comparison between the factory farmed sort of Orwellian version of meat production, where you have, for instance, if you take cattle, you have them raised usually on pasture, and then you move them onto feedlots, and you fatten them up, and you feed them a bunch of antibiotics and hormones, and then you just sort of mass slaughter them, and they're separated from their families, and they're kind of isolated and detached, and in their small cow brains, they're very sad about this whole process. What if instead of that, you had them like on pasture for their entire lives, like grass-fed and finished? And when you killed them, it was quick and painless. And up to that point, they lived like the best possible life of any creature, better than they would in nature, better than they do in the factory farms for sure. And arguably better than many human lives. That's like literally other than the small cow brain part at least. What about that comparison? How does that compare in your mind? And what do you think people are going to think about that if that becomes the conversation? That's where I would go. Jamarl, in the last couple of seconds here, what's your take?
The problem is cost. Any corporation, any company that's going to be in a business is going to do it with the idea of maxing out. They want to get as much money as they can. If they are doing that and putting that much attention, it's going to drive up costs. Now, people may pay for that. So that, like you said, that could be part of the conversation. But from the standpoint of the company, fiscal pressures are going to be against doing that. It's going to be more in favor of putting them in cages, putting as many chickens in a container as you possibly can, shooting them up with steroids, or shooting them up with things to keep them awake while, the chickens pecking each other to death. Like, it's that type of stuff because you can get the more bang for your buck out of it. And so if you're going to do this other stuff, you're going to put more fiscal pressures on it. But again, people may pay for it. And if people pay for it, who knows?
I hear you on that one. You know what? We should come back to this conversation later, and we probably will in future headlines. You guys have been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in just a minute with Jamarl's monologue.
Fault Lines. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM. and 1390 AM. We're also kicking around in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming us on, definitely give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in with the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. So I'm just going to start here. And this is radio, so I'm going to be polite in the way I say this. But Obama, former President Barack Obama, was and continues to be full of something that is dark, squishy, and that stinks to high heaven. Yes, the same Barack Obama that won president in 2008 on the mantle of hope and change, a meaningless slogan that was in no way accomplished or even sought after. Still going with the stupid on stilts logic that Democrats lost seats in the House because of progressives, because of defunding the police. It stirred the crowd. It undermined the election. Biden didn't necessarily get his additional seats in the House, and Biden didn't necessarily win the Senate, potentially, because of progressives. Now, mind you, the candidates that backed Medicare for All and the Green New Deal won their seats. Also, it's totally coincidental that this line of logic is beneficial to corporate Democrats who never wants to take acknowledge their own failures in this stuff. It's always somebody else's fault. If it's the Russians, if it's Comey, or in this case, it's progressives. Obama tells Peter Hamby, host of the Snapchat show Good Luck America, quote, "You lost a big audience the minute you say it, which makes it a lot less likely you're actually going to get the changes you want done." The former president said in an interview scheduled to go live at 6 a.m. on Wednesday, according to Axios. The key is deciding, do you want to actually get something done, or do you want to feel good among people you already agree with, Obama added. Catchy slogan. Obama makes the point about a catchy slogan, like the meaningless catchy slogan of hope and change. I mean, let's be clear. During Obama's tenure, Democrats lost 1,100 more than 1,100 seats in the House, the Senate, all throughout the United States. Even in the House of Representatives, they lost the House and they lost the Senate during Obama's tenure. So this notion of, do you want to be catchy and get things done? Yes, Obama was able to stay in office, but the feat of losing that much, honestly, if you were trying to do it on purpose, I would have my doubts that you could do it on purpose. That is the degree of failure to which we are talking about. And this kind of gets to my point. Multiculturalism is not equal to progressive. And I know not everybody, people feels dodgy about saying stuff like that, but I'll say it because it's flat fact true. Yes, there's something to be said about multiculturalism that works in tandem with being a lefty, and meaning you can be both. But multiculturalism in and of itself is not progressive. It could be, but it is not necessarily the case. Now, the reason I say this, the reason why I have to say this, is because the Democratic Party continues to distract with multiculturalism. And the media would call this progressive. You would hear these whispers of progressives about Biden's campaign. Biden would say, hey, my campaign, I already have enough progressives in my campaign. What are you talking about? Who? I don't feel represented. I don't know any lefties that feel represented. Rahm Emanuel, the guy that hid an execution, the guy that hid lead in the water, that guy is representative of somehow of lefties. Neera Tanden, who never has a good word to say about the left, that person is representative. The other person that's going to be Secretary of State that is associated with all of these wars and all of these killings I guess I'm making the very basic point that just because you have a multicultural campaign or administration or cabinet, you have people, all these various races, that does not, in fact, mean it's on the left. Democrats use this to distract and to shield from real, actual criticism. You would have somebody who's like, Medicare for all, and then, poof, black person. Green New Deal, poof, hermaphrodite. And somebody says, wait a minute, what about the policies? Oh, you're being racist. You're being racist. No. The key point here is you can keep the identity. Give us the Medicare for all. You can keep the identity. Give us expansion of Social Security. Give us this notion of elimination of student debt and free colleges and universities. Those are things that people want. Those are things that people need. Those are things that directly benefit those particular identities that you claim to represent. The trick that they are playing here is that the public has this implicit belief that a disadvantaged community or a person from a disadvantaged community, whatever that community is, will somehow, in the things that they do and the decisions that they make, benefit those communities. And by definition of benefiting those communities, they would have to be progressive, right? Wrong. The issue is here is class. The issue is not necessarily race. Yes, you can have continuity from the standpoint in regards to policy and framing of mind and way of thinking and everything else with a change in the exterior. But the change in the exterior is not the point. The point is, what are they doing in that office? People or policy. And when those people have a track record of acting a particular way, they're going to act that way. Obama's blackness didn't stop him from giving 95% of the income gains to the top 1%. His blackness didn't stop him from allowing homeowners, many of which were black, to go bust. His blackness didn't stop him from the drone bombings or the killings around the globe, many of which people of color. I mean, for God's sake, they're selling slaves in Libya, black slaves. His blackness did not stop him from cleaning up the water in Flint, Michigan. What did he do? He went there and took a sip of the water as if the water was okay, mocking the people in that place that had to deal with those kids that was drinking that lead water and the illnesses in those communities. Nor did it get him to tell his chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, to clean up Chicago and deal with the dirty, filthy, lead-riddled water in that city. His blackness didn't do any of that stuff. I'm making the point that the issue is class. Don't get distracted with these ideas of identity as if identity is the greatest thing. Yes, I want various identities to be represented, but I want them to be genuinely represented. And by genuinely represented, I mean doing things, tangible, political, policy things that are in the interest of those communities. And what you've seen are these whispers of progressives without any talk of policy, as if a person just standing there as a statue is somehow progressive. Nonsense. It is what you do, not what you look like or what you are. It is what you do. And fact of the matter is, what people do has not even been discussed. That's not what people are talking about. That's not the thing that's up for conversation. No. You get various identities and they would say, oh, this is the most diverse presidency in history. And you ask yourself, what does that mean if they're not really necessarily doing anything for those communities in real terms? It's just theatrics. And it's theatrics that works against our interests. They use Black Lives Matter for props. I told you they'll do that. They use Jacob Blake as a prop. I told you they'll do that. They use George Floyd as a prop. I told you they would do that. And I told you at the end of all of that, they would win the presidency and all of that stuff will go away. Look, this is something that they do and they've been doing for God knows how long. It's easy to see. You just have to pay attention to it. I'm just making the very basic point that don't get tricked into this belief that just because he has a diverse, cabinet or a diverse administration, that is in any way indicative of lefty or progressivism. Look at what they do. That is what matters, not how they look. Shane, what do you think about that? I mean, Obama comes out and trashes lefties, but at the end of the day, people were thinking that Obama, the black president, is going to do something fundamentally different. And he was just, surprise, a Democrat.
Yeah. No, that's been widely noted. I mean, we've got about a minute here, so
yeah,
I'll try to be
pushed
quick.
this up against the hour. I'm sorry. Hey, let's come back to the
No. We should do it. Yeah, we were talking about the lab-grown meat stuff for a while in headlines, and so that's completely real briefly on identity politics in general. I pretty universally have criticized identity, the explicit focus and the sole focus on identity politics by many members of the Democrat Party, by like the quote unquote left, specifically a lot of young folks criticize that all the time. On the other hand, I'm actually going to not even defend it for a second. I haven't seen a sufficiently deep sort of philosophical rebuttal of the idea that if you're trying to solve oppression in different ways, you shouldn't focus on culture and the language that culture uses and the attitudes that we have in culture towards different groups. And another way to put this is I feel like I would need to see that to feel like I could have a conversation with somebody who holds those deep beliefs and prioritizes cultural grievances over material grievances specifically. I feel like I would need to have that basis in order to have that conversation with some confidence and to feel like I know what I'm talking about and like I'm not just merely taking one side and yet another, strife-driven political dynamic. In any event, we should come back to this. It's an interesting conversation. We should also get guests on about it. And we almost got into this conversation with Peter Coffin a few days ago. Hopefully we'll get back into that with him soon. In any event, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in just a minute.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Watson. We are joined by Eleanor Nell Watson. She's a researcher in emerging technologies whose work focuses on the importance of protecting human rights and putting ethics, safety, and the values of the human spirit into the development of AI. She serves as senior scientific advisor to the Future Society, AI researcher at Singularity University, and holds fellowships from the British Computing Society and Royal Statistical Society, among others. Nell, thank you for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. Thank you again for being with us. All right. I wanted to talk about AlphaFold and to get an explanation from somebody I know to be able to deliver it well. AlphaFold, as far as I can tell, I'll try to put this very simply. It is an AI program. It's a neural net, basically a sort of set of tools developed by DeepMind, which is a kind of a part of Google. I believe they're funded by Alphabet, but they also have other funders headed up by Demis Hassabis and doing groundbreaking work. A lot of the recent advances that people would have heard about in the AI space have come out of DeepMind. This includes AlphaGo and sort of the various game-playing neural nets and AIs that were beating pretty much everybody in StarCraft 2, in Go, and maybe even in chess. Jamarl and I were actually arguing about this one yesterday, about whether or not AI had the lead in chess. Maybe we can come back to that at some point during the conversation. But the big news here is on Monday, AlphaFold, which again, part of DeepMind, a sort of set of tools created by DeepMind, appears to have solved a long-standing problem in the biological sciences, particularly the protein folding problem, like a 50-year-old massive problem. just briefly, bringing it to the conversation here now. What is that problem? Did AlphaFold actually solve it? If so, what does that even what does that mean? No.
Well, I don't know about solving it exactly, but it is a very significant advance. Certainly, this new development in technology means that we can model an approximation of proteins in a far more efficient manner. Now, that modeling is not one for one. It's not perfect, and it involves a bit of prediction. But it seems to be reasonably close to the ground truth, at least for most proteins, the most common kinds of proteins. And that means that it's likely to greatly accelerate all kinds of medical research, which is very exciting.
So just so I'm understanding, it's basically predicting, I guess, the shape of these. I remember at one point when it was the DNA. It was trying to model DNA. And human beings was like, yes, we got the model of DNA. And I remember somebody saying, we try also protein. It was like, we need to do protein. Because the protein has so many shapes and is so ingrained into us. The amino acid chains and everything else. So basically, it's predicting these, and the predictions itself allows for certain actions. Is that what I'm understanding? Like one certain form gives function, and so as it takes a particular form or takes a particular shape in three-dimensional space, it would have a certain effect within the body. And you guys are basically able to mimic this. Am I getting this right?
That's it. Yes, exactly. So DNA is only the start. DNA can teach us about how proteins form, a string of about 20 amino acids. But that string itself is not terribly useful. It doesn't tell us exactly what the body is doing with those proteins. We need to simulate how those proteins fold together, how those proteins execute from a sort of one-dimensional string into 3 dimensions. And they're not just like a cube or a sphere. They are enormously complicated structures, and that makes them very computationally expensive to try to simulate. However, this new technique essentially looks at existing data. So it compares a database of amino acids and proteins, and therefore uses that as a template in order to make predictions about what a string of amino acids is going to turn into without needing to do all of that simulation. And that is a fantastic shortcut for all kinds of different research.
How is this solved, or not even solved, but what was the sort of next best approximation technique that was used for this stuff? In other words, before AlphaFold came along, how are we trying to do this?
Right. So there's been a competition called CASP, C-A-S-P, which stands for Critical Assessment for Structure Prediction. And it's been run for about the last 25 years or so, as gradually different techniques have come around to try to do these simulations or these predictions in a more efficient manner. And there hasn't been any great leaps in quite a long time. Research has been relatively incremental, so going up a few percentage points year on year. But in the last 2 to 3 years, we've seen a huge leap, largely due to the revolution in machine learning, and a lot of that driven by DeepMind and other similar approaches using massive, very complex machine learning models. And this latest leap forward with AlphaFold 2 is a very substantial discontinuity. It is a jump ahead, which people were not expecting for possibly decades to come. And so that's why it's taken the whole research community by surprise.
So just so I'm understanding this, because I've seen machines look at the brain and come away with being able to basically say, okay, this person is thinking about this, and get it with a reasonable degree of certainty if it's something simplistic. But the way they were able to do that was basically analyzing the signals that was going back and forth. And, it's like when the brain is in this configuration or has this particular energy or this, or brain waves, this is the model that the person comes up with. But they're doing that by analyzing the brain in and of itself first. Is that what this is doing? Basically, it's looking at protein structures. And based on the analysis of the protein structures itself, it's coming back with, okay, this is what we expect, as opposed to having equations as a base to do it. Meaning, were they writing down equations that the machine was just better at analyzing to give you extrapolations? Or is it analyzing the structures itself in order to come up with a model for new structures?
Well, I should caution that we haven't had that much research out of DeepMind yet. It's largely based off a blog post and a few comments from journals such as Nature. We're still waiting for a lot of that research to come out. But I suppose you can liken it to an intuitive leap. So you can puzzle about a problem using your logic, your cognition, and you can chew on it step by step in order to come up with an answer. And traditionally, that's what protein modeling looks like. It's an extremely laborious process, both from a human perspective as well as from a computational perspective too. But these new techniques appear to use a kind of an intuitive leap in order to get to a close approximation of the truth without needing to go through every single step in order to get there. It's a little bit like using wisdom and experience to leapfrog all of those cognitive steps that otherwise might need to be taken. And that means that given the existing limitations of computer hardware that we have today, we can get a great deal more bang for our buck, so to speak.
Actually, one thing that might be useful for folks listening is to step back for a second. We're talking about deep learning and neural nets, just to give people a brief primer on what those even are and how those are meaningfully different than previous approaches to the development of AI. So we've been trying to do neural nets. People have been trying to create neural nets for decades at this point. But just briefly, Nell, within the next minute or so before we go into the break, what are they, to be clear? And why are they seeing such success in recent years as opposed to previous decades?
Sure. So traditionally, if we wanted to work with computers, we had to program them step by step. So we had to give every possible instruction, and we had to create a rule that would move things ahead, given a certain state or position that the program might find itself in. And if those rules weren't in operation, the program wouldn't know what to do, and it would probably break. But from the 1980s onward, we started to develop machine learning techniques where instead of having to program computers, we could instead give them examples. So essentially, we could feed in pictures of birds and train the system to recognize birds in photographs when it started to see them. However, those approaches were, until recently, rather limited. Around about 10 years ago, we discovered that having lots of data to throw at the problem gave surprisingly good results, especially if that data was filtered through many different layers that helped to create more nuance out of that data. Finally, now we're starting to realize, just in the last year or so, that massive models, where you invest a lot of time and money in creating models that can deal with a stupendous number of parameters, gives, again, another disproportionate advance in capability. And that's leading to new models that are orders of magnitude more powerful. And so I think this revelation within the world of biology and structured biology is going to be mirrored by similar revolutionary advances in other domains as well.
And now we've got to go into a break in about just a couple of seconds here, but I also just want to throw one other thing in that I've seen. I want to check with you. Also compute. Also, like specifically, sort of obliquely, through video gaming, through folks needing more and more graphical processing power from their GPUs, and arguably potentially through the rise of cryptocurrencies, which were also GPU intensive. Aren't GPUs and the basically the R&D that was invested in GPUs, isn't that very quickly repurposed for doing the programming, both in terms of creating the data sets, but also in terms of actually letting the neural nets run very efficiently? Is that another part of this?
It is. It's a very important part, actually. So during the mid-90s, when we started to get 3D acceleration in our gaming consoles and PCs, engineers had to come up with ways of dealing with very complex mathematics in a real-time way, so as fast as possible. And in order to do that, they came up with parallel forms of computing that could break up complex problems and work on them in isolation and then put the results all together. And it turns out that that's very similar to how real biological brains function. And so you can use these technologies for crypto, of course, but also for very sophisticated and powerful machine learning techniques. And that has greatly accelerated the amount of compute that we have available.
Folks, you're listening to the voice of Nell Watson. She is a researcher in emerging technologies whose work focuses on the importance of protecting human rights and putting ethics, safety, and the values of the human spirit into the development of AI. You're also listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break, but we will be back in just a minute.
Fault Lines.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us for actually a fascinating conversation, Nell Watson, a researcher in emerging technologies whose work focuses on the importance of protecting human rights and putting ethics, safety, and the values of the human spirit into the development of AI. She serves as Senior Scientific Advisor to the Future Society, AI researcher at Singularity University, and holds fellowships from the British Computing Society and Royal Statistical Society, among others. That is a fascinating resume. One question on that, putting ethics or the safety and the values of the human spirit into the development of AI. I always love the emancipatory language when human beings reference themselves. But do we really want our values and ethics into computers, considering the way we treat one another? And how do you ensure that that takes place? Because if you think about it, it seems like there's a trend towards going in the direction, basically, of whoever pays. If that is the government that is paying for some kind of technology to monitor, to restrain, to injure, or to oversee, it goes that way. People will pay for it, and people will do it because they're paying for it. How do we stop stuff like that? Because stuff like that seems impossible to stop at this point.
Oh, there is definitely a big concern about ethics washing, as they call it, where organizations make a cursory attempt to cover their interests and appear to be legitimate, but aren't necessarily. And I think that's something that a lot of people need to be mindful of, and need to be somewhat skeptical of various ethical initiatives out there with regards to emerging technologies. But there is a lot of good work being done in creating standards and certifications for AI, as well as data sets which are more inclusive and less biased, and are able to include more people. And I think, as we've just discussed about some of the great advances in machine learning and how that's coming to other domains, I think we're going to see similar advances within how we deal with the AI we connect to in our home devices and on our cell phones. Instead of simply asking about what tomorrow's weather is going to be, we're very soon going to start having conversations which to us feel meaningful. And perhaps AI is actually going to become a kind of a social presence in our lives. But if that's to be the case, then we need to socialize that presence. We need to make it a welcome presence in our lives, and one that doesn't embarrass or disturb us. And to do that, I think it's important that we teach machines about our cultures so that they can recognize what might be appropriate at a wedding, but might not be appropriate at a funeral, for example. And so that they can recognize our behavior in different situations and contexts, to understand that maybe if we do something they don't recognize, that we're not doing anything bad per se. That's simply how things operate in our culture. And if we can teach machines that, we can bring the wonder of machine learning safely and ethically to more people.
I think that misses something, though. I mean, that kind of makes my point a bit. If machines get to the point of being able to recognize human behavior in the same way they can recognize, let's say, play chess, or they can play Go, or some of these other things, well, it's not the machines I'm concerned about. It's the human element in this, and the human element that strives for profit. And in the striving for profit, will get those computers to do things that, yeah, they may analyze that behavior, but what are they analyzing that behavior in pursuit of? Oftentimes, this technology is not used for the better interest. It's used for whoever pays for it. I guess what I'm asking is, how does that trend stop? Because it feels very dystopian to me. Even though the computer, yes, you may be able to talk to it, and yes, it may feel like it's part of your home or whatever, but it also may be monitoring you. It also may be watching you as you go down the street from point A to point B. Like, it may be facial recognition as you walk through and cataloging this stuff. I guess I'm saying there's a lot of things that these computers can be doing that is not necessarily something that I guess I would be comfortable with, and a lot of people wouldn't be comfortable with, but it doesn't seem capable of stopping the trend line towards that direction of dominance as opposed to cooperation.
Well, I think you have some great points. There's a lot of potential for these technologies to be used in very coercive ways that manipulate people, that give us false impressions about the world, or that curtail freedom of reach, the ability to connect with others or to have our voices heard if people are shadow banned or if information is gerrymandered so that people can't spread it. However, I also observe that in the world of technology, a lot of innovation comes from the world of open source. That is very much the those with the ability, giving technology and ideas to those with needs. Essentially, it's very often true. A lot of people volunteering and giving fantastic technologies to the wider world, and with a lot of peer review, so that code that is suspect or maybe flawed can hopefully be checked up on and fixed. And I think if we can encourage a greater openness in development, more open source initiatives, and more transparency in how technology is developed and deployed, hopefully we can help to mitigate some of those more coercive aspects.
This actually gets into another conversation we were having on this topic yesterday, which is AGI and sort of recursively self-improving AI. In other words, artificial intelligence that, to put it in sort of simple layperson terms, becomes self-aware and self-developing. And often the fears that people have had about artificial intelligence have had to do with this type of scenario, a sort of singularitarian scenario, where an AI improves itself and improves its ability to improve itself and so on recursively, to the point where very quickly it's unrecognizable, it's super dominant, and at that point all bets are in some sense off. And so a lot of the work that folks are doing is in preparing us for some scenario like that, and making sure that on the other side of that, catastrophic damage doesn't immediately occur. Here's the thing with what you were just talking about, with open source development, with free and transparent development of this technology, that might help in the short run with some of the ethics, but it seems like that would also make it a lot easier for some party to irresponsibly, very quickly develop that kind of AI. In other words, if everybody's sharing information with each other about how to develop an AGI, then any party at that point could do so, which means they might do so in an unsavory way, or they might develop an AI that goes on to become an AGI with some unsavory sort of ethical beliefs, perspectives, or actions. What's your perspective on that? Now, how should we try to prevent that? Can we prevent that? How does that factor into the conversation about transparency?
I think that's a reasonably likely scenario. Not that necessarily that AGI will take over the world, but that there's likely to be arms races or a race to the bottom, whereby all kinds of organizations compete to throw as much compute power into these systems as possible in order to be the first to develop some new technology. And we've already started to see that a little bit with these new massive models of GPT-3 and so forth, which have come out of OpenAI. And that has opened the floodgates. So now people are realizing that throwing more and more compute into these problems can give potentially orders of magnitude more improvement. And so we're going to see organizations, both corporates and state organizations, dumping computer resources into AI. And I think if there's another significant advance in AutoML, which is one of the algorithms used for experimental recursive self-improvement of AI, then again, organizations may want to be the first in order to deploy that technology. And if there's a race, people are likely to be careless, and those things aren't likely to be done in a safe or prudent manner. And I think it's important perhaps to have something like an International Atomic Energy Authority, but for AI, to help spread best practices, to help to monitor potential bad uses of AI, as well as try, although it may be very difficult, to frustrate access from very bad actors getting access to those technologies.
I guess my fear, and we only have maybe 2 minutes left, is that the bad actors would be the corporations, not necessarily a rogue programmer here or there, but a company,
or an intelligence agency,
right?
Or a massive government.
I mean, think of flying drones that automatically determine who's the enemy and kills. The programmer at that point is making the determining factor on who that thing kills. And yet it's being used at the behest of other people. What about the hacking in the other governments that the CIA was doing? I mean, all of that stuff ended up online for everybody to find. I don't want to be overly down here. That's not where I'm trying to go. Because we started off on a really good point. Because both of these things kind of exist side by side. And you can't necessarily get one without getting the other, unfortunately. Where does this go? Let's say to the better angels of this, especially from the standpoint of the biological research. What can they use that for within the last 30 seconds or last minute that we have?
Sure. I mean, some of the best uses of AI particularly this new advance in protein folding. I mean, it may lead to immense discoveries that help to reduce the effects of aging, to extend lifespan, to create amazing new drugs that target different conditions in a very efficient and precise manner. We may come up with cures for cancer. We may come up with more nutritious plants or enzymes that can deconstruct plastic. We may improve bioprinting of organs and cultured meat.
Oh, wow.
And I think also there's opportunities within evolutionary research.
Eleanor, we need
so much to talk about.
We need to cut this here, but that is utterly and entirely fascinating. Eleanor, the voice you were listening to is Eleanor Nell Watson, researcher in emerging technologies whose work focuses on the importance of protecting human rights and putting ethics, safety, and values in the human spirit in the development of AI. She serves as senior scientific advisor to the Future Society, AI researcher at Singularity University, and holds fellowships from the British Computing Society and Royal Statistical Society, among others. And you guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
From the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system. Your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to the headlines in the news. Let me make sure this is right. Good. In the news, Britain has become the first country in the West to approve a COVID-19 vaccine for public use. The UK Department of Health and Social Care confirmed in a statement to British news agencies that the vaccine developed jointly by American drug maker Pfizer and Germany's BioNTech would be distributed starting next week. Pfizer was the first of three major Western pharmaceutical companies to apply in both the United States and Europe for emergency use authorization. In line with the planning in the U.S., British frontline healthcare workers, care home residents, the very elderly, and people with underlying conditions that make them particularly vulnerable to COVID-19 complications are expected to get the first doses of the vaccine. Pfizer's vaccine, like Oxford and Moderna's formulas, require 2 doses about a month apart. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention is reducing the number of days one should quarantine after being exposed to the virus from 14 days to 7 to 10 days. Dr. Robert Redfield, director of the CDC, made the announcement during a coronavirus task force meeting on Tuesday. Dr. Redfield informed Vice President Mike Pence and the White House Coronavirus Task Force that the CDC will be issuing new orders on the number of days that the person who has been in direct contact with COVID virus should quarantine, quote, soon, unquote. The new guidelines recommend that someone who has been exposed to or has close contact with the virus should quarantine for 7 to 10 days, which is less than the originally recommended 14 days. According to the new guidelines, the individual can end their quarantine after 7 days with a negative COVID-19 test or 10 days without a test. Interesting. President Trump tweeted late Tuesday that he would veto the National Defense Authorization Act unless Congress repeals Section 230 of the 1996 Communications Decency Act, which critics say unfairly shields social media platforms from liability over items posted on their platforms. These opponents have been vocal that tech behemoths like Twitter and Facebook should no longer be shielded as neutral platforms when they operate more like a publisher. The criticism seemed to reach its tipping point during the Hunter Biden scandal and the weeks prior to the presidential election. The New York Post ran an explosive report that showed emails from Hunter Biden linking his father to his Ukraine business dealings and other media of Hunter Biden showing illicit behavior. Republican Senator Ted Cruz, Lindsey Graham, and Josh Hawley called the heads of Twitter and Facebook at the time to testify. Shane, what do you think about this? I mean, Donald Trump, look, like I said before in the earlier part of the show, it's really, there's an irony to this, that the Democratic Party basically did the same thing when Hillary Clinton lost. Think back, bought all of the social media companies, wrapped them on the knuckles. What are you going to do to make sure that opinions that are unfavorable to us don't get out to the American public? And, you know, they had to be contrite, they had to bow their heads. But what did Republicans do? Republicans wanted more out. The stuff that people consider to be racist, sexist, bigoted, whatever, Republicans want that stuff shown because to some degree they believe that it hurts them for it not to be shown. And some of that stuff trends the line, right? But at the end of the day, you have, like you made the point, Democrats are trying to get them to censor, Republicans are trying to get them to open it up. And the tech companies are in the middle of this. And keep in mind, Trump loses and he attacks the Twitter, Facebook with this notion of restraining information. Whereas Hillary Clinton lost and the Democrats attacked Facebook and Twitter for putting out too much information. Isn't that bizarre? What do you think, Shane?
You know what? We can go back and forth on this in so many ways. One new thing I'll try to bring into the conversation. I like that it's the Defense Authorization Act, and in its own way, it makes sense. I like that that's what he's holding hostage here. You have a bunch of military industrial contractors who are waiting on some assurance that they'll get paid. And, he's making them cry uncle, or at least he's trying to. So that's, you can see what I'm saying. I think that's hopefully that'll be an effective tactic. Whether or not repealing Section 230, whether or not that's the right way to solve this problem, that's another question. What would come on the other side of that? What would be opening ourselves up to? Even whether or not that's feasible, especially going into a Biden administration with the Democrat-held House, whether or not the Republicans, who are the main folks who would be pushing for that kind of thing, whether they can do anything about it, that's a whole other question, practically. So we'll see. I mean,
gotta be honest.
Nobody likes weird things.
Under normal circumstances, like, this is a hostage that I'm okay if he shoots, with a caveat that the UFO stuff is in this bill. And if Trump shoots this, the UFO stuff goes with it. I know that's so petty, right? But my expectations and my hopes have gotten so deadened that that's all I'm reaching for. That's all I want. Now, January is the last date for this. Meaning, if this doesn't get passed by January, you have a new Congress, and all of this goes up until the next guy.
I don't know, man. It's like he has a serial killer held hostage.
How serious?
He has a serial killer held hostage, and you're like, you can't kill that guy. He has a great fashion sense. Like, you're addicted to. It's just...
It's like, oh, she was too attractive to die. It's like, what?
Exactly.
Do you think he's serious about this? By the way, like the 230 thing? I mean, I agree with you. I don't know what's on the other side of getting rid of 230. And from my understanding, 230 has been the thing that has allowed the internet to be the internet. Meaning, Facebook might not exist. Twitter might not exist if everything that you post on Twitter, they're liable. That's, and I got to be honest, Trump, Ted Cruz, these guys to some degree are taking this out of context in regards to the way that Article 230 works. It allows them to do what they do in regards to exclude some of this content that's, that trends outside the boundaries of what they consider. And they get some leeway on that. The catch becomes, when does it get obscene? And the Hunter Biden thing was obscene. They did not, they allow any bit of information to show up for Trump. But Hunter Biden, all of them played defense. And they made sure that stuff wasn't shown. So,
so the fact that stuff is allowed by some interpretation of Section 230, it means that you need to take another look at that law, at least how it's interpreted, at least give some, lay down some new rulings on it that change the interpretation so that kind of behavior isn't allowed. That's my personal opinion. Whether that involves a complete repeal, which would invoke some kind of rewrite, because you're going to need some protections for publishers. There's going to need to be something on that. That's the other side of this. That's the other side of this. It's not the sky completely falling. Maybe for a little while. Maybe in terms of the rhetoric around it. But it's in terms of where people are. Look at the investor class. Where do they want to throw their money? to big tech companies. That's been one of the big places for them to put their money and see some reliable returns here. Do you really think that the Congress in the United States, whole political system, would let that opportunity slide by, looking at how substantial the FANG companies are, in our stock market? This might seem like an oblique point, but we're not willing to risk the actual death of the internet. This is just rhetoric as far as I can tell.
Yeah, good point. Because like you said, we don't know what's on the other side. What about the tech companies themselves? What about changing the tech companies themselves? And we've talked about this before, this notion in that public commons. I would almost guarantee you that rain, hail, sleet, snow, there's going to be some guy standing on a box in DC screaming about something. But the problem is that guy might get 3-4 people. And in our age, you're talking to, you have people with millions of viewers or millions of subscribers. Like, this is our commons now. And yet that commons is owned by a corporation whose main impetus is profit. And so you get this kind of monetized reality. But more importantly, what you say, to some degree, can be curtailed by people who don't particularly like what you say, even if what you're saying is not necessarily off the rails. And so is there something to be said for doing something to the tech companies where these things function more like, more like something that's, let's say, publicly owned? I guess I'm trying to get at, doesn't it go deeper than just Section 230? Does it go to something that is a little more substantial in regards to ensuring the public gets their say? And I don't know what that looks like. I don't know if that's adding something to the law that allows people to get free speech, but I don't know how that works in the context of a private company. Like, I
definitely don't see that. That wouldn't solve, just to be clear, that would not solve the underlying problem that a lot of people have with tech companies right now, which is that they engage in politically driven censorship. If they're suddenly owned by the government, if I were to wave my wand and they were now publicly owned, whatever that looks like for the stockholders, whatever that looks like for the executives within the tech companies, et cetera, up and down the line, how they, what they work with, their fiduciary obligations are, and to whom. With that last point, to whom, if they're now literally owned and run by the government, that doesn't mean that they're not going to engage in.
It could make it worse.
They will. It will make it. I can see it
make it worse
very quickly.
Think of what Trump did with Fauci, or with information he didn't like, where he tried to pull the information inside the government to ensure that the executive branch can ensure what data gets out and stuff like that. Yeah, you're right. That might actually make it worse. That might make it worse.
Yeah, there's no. Like you say often, Jamarl, there are no easy outs. Reality did not give you any easy outs. This is one of those cases where, you're up against a genuine dilemma, and it's a fork in the road. And in some sense, for all the conversation we're having about it and society as a whole is having about it, what's actually going to determine it in large part is the wheels of power turning behind the scenes, behind the curtain, so to speak.
Yeah, these conversations continue to get dark. Even the last one with Eleanor. Like, it wasn't intentional to go that way, but it seems technology inexorably goes with whoever's paying for it. And the people who are paying for it, oftentimes, like you said, intelligence agencies, companies that deal with issues of dominance, and the public itself seems to be the afterthought. So it just seems to be the way it goes. Let's get back to headlines. The Justice Department is investigating a bribery scheme that has directed money to the White House or used political contributions in exchange for presidential pardon, according to documents released Tuesday. The district court in Washington, D.C. released 20 pages of heavily redacted documents that do not identify who is being investigated nor the timing of the alleged scheme. The government motion was initially submitted to Chief Judge Burl A. Howell under seal in order to obtain permission to review certain attorney-client communications prosecutors believe proved potential criminal activity, quote unquote. A filter team working on behalf of the government was going through several terabytes of data that had seized from over 50 electronic devices such as iPhones, iPads, laptops, thumb drives, and hard drives. Prosecutors asked the court for permission to review email communications they believe reveal a, quote, bribery scheme, conspiracy scheme, in which component redacted, would offer a substantial political contribution in exchange for presidential pardon or reprieve of sentence for, and again, that part is redacted, unquote. On Tuesday evening, after the release of court documents, an official with the Justice Department sought to tamp down speculation about who might be the target of the probe. Quote, "No government official was or is currently a subject or target of the investigation disclosed in this filing," unquote, the official said. In a breakthrough, a month after the deadly conflict cut off of Ethiopia's Tigray region from the world, the United Nations on Wednesday said it and the Ethiopian government have signed a deal to allow unimpeded humanitarian access, at least for areas under federal government control, after the Prime Minister's declaration of victory over the weekend. This would allow first food, medicines, and other aid into the region of 6 million people that has seen rising hunger during the fighting between the federal and Tigray regional governments. Each regards the other as illegal and a power struggle that has been months in the making. For weeks, the UN and others have pleaded with access and reports of supplies running desperately low for millions of people. A UN humanitarian spokesman, Savino Abre, said the first mission is to carry out needs assessment, which will begin on Wednesday. And for the last one, Singapore has given regulatory approval for the first, quote, clean meat, unquote, that does not come from slaughtered animals. The decision paves the way for San Francisco-based startup Eat Just to sell lab-grown chicken meat. The meat will initially be used in nuggets, but the company hasn't said when they will become available. Demand for alternatives to regular meat have surged due to consumer concerns about health, animal welfare, and the environment. According to Barclays, the market for the meat alternatives could be worth $140 billion within the next decade, or about 10% of the $1.4 trillion global meat industry. The company called it a breakthrough for the global food industry and hopes that countries will now follow suit. Over the last decade, dozens of startups have attempted to bring cultured meat to the market, hoping to win over conventional meat eaters with the promise of more ethical product. Two of the largest are Israel-based Future Meat Technologies and the Bill Gates-backed Memphis Meats, which are both trying to enter the market with affordable and tasty lab-grown meats. Singapore's Siok Meat is working on lab-grown crustacean meat. While many have touted environmental benefits, some scientists have suggested it might be worse for the climate under some circumstances. Wow. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, so let's go. This ran over a little bit, so let's go into a break. You guys are listening to Headlines with Fault Line. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. If you guys are in Kansas City, you can catch us at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. Also, if you're digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give up the like and share that video or that audio. And I want to emphasize that point. Definitely make sure you're subscribed. I think Google has been basically getting rid of some of our subscribers on Fault Lines and on my channel. So definitely make sure that you hit the subscription button on whatever channel you're listening to it. And if you indeed enjoy it, definitely smash that like button. You can also give us a call. This is going to be an open segment at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. You can give us a chat, a tweet, or the call. I want to start here for this. I love this. This gentleman goes absolutely nuclear. Now, the person who you're going to hear is Gabriel Sterling. He's from Georgia, and he's very, very upset with the president of the United States. He's upset with Trump because Trump has been throwing one conspiracy theory out after the next. His minions have been throwing out these conspiracy theories, going as far as to say that the governor of Georgia, Kemp, who's a Trump supporter, was working with the Venezuelans, Hugo Chavez, Nicolas Maduro, the Cubans, and the Chinese. This is in and of itself profound, but this is the stuff that they were saying and they were accusing the governor of. So this gentleman has some very strong feelings about it when somebody was basically threatened, their life being threatened. Let's play the clip.
It has all gone too far. All of it. Joe DeGenova today asked for Chris Krebs, a patriot who ran CISA, to be shot. A 20-something tech in Gwinnett County today has death threats and a noose put out saying he should be hung for treason because he was transferring a report on batches from an EMS to a county computer so he could read it. It has to stop. Mr. President, you have not condemned these actions or this language. Senators, you have not condemned this language or these actions. This has to stop. We need you to step up, and if you're going to take a position of leadership, show some. My boss, Secretary Raffensperger, his address is out there. They have people doing caravans around their house. They've had people come onto their property. Tricia, his wife of 40 years, is getting sexualized threats through her cell phone. It has to stop. This is elections. This is the backbone of democracy, and all of you who have not said a damn word are complicit in this. I can't begin to explain the level of anger I have right now over this. And every American, every Georgian, Republican and Democrat alike should have that same level of anger. Mr. President, it looks like you likely lost the state of Georgia. We're investigating. There's always a possibility. I get it. You have the rights to go through the courts. What you don't have the ability to do, and you need to step up and say this, is stop inspiring people to commit potential acts of violence. Someone's going to get hurt. Someone's going to get shot. Someone's going to get killed. And it's not right.
Now, William Barr has basically said that they've done their investigation. They haven't seen any level of fraud that would change the election. And considering that Barr is Trump's guy, that gives it a sort of a bit more credibility. Also, you know, Georgia and the governor of Georgia are Trump supporters. Again, these things have consequences. Donald Trump has, millions of followers. There are, 300 million people in this country? He got nearly half of the tally of the vote. So let's say just 10%. Let's say you get 10% support among 300 million people. How many of those people are not wrapped tight? And of those people that are not wrapped tight, how many of those would do something thinking to themselves, the president won this and these guys are trying to topple democracy itself? I guess I'm making the point that what Trump is doing does have consequences, despite the fact that Democrats did this to Trump. When Democrats lost, it was fraud. They went on talking about fraud for 3 years. Then all of a sudden, on a dime, despite the fact that they really didn't do anything different from the standpoint of the electoral process, all of a sudden, no fraud. Election perfect. How do you make that jump that fast from this notion of ensconced in fraud, so much so that we need to nearly depose the president of the United States. But now no fraud. Everything's good. And the president of the United States is the one calling for fraud. And the president of the United States is getting people basically death threats. Shane, what do you think, man? Look, the guy has a point. If this was somebody in your family and they started getting death threats, or if this was somebody you were friends with, and they were getting death threats because the president of the United States is coming up with a cockamamie scheme, saying that he was defrauded in some way. And look, again, all the Republicans have basically said, let him get his votes, let him get his days in court and all of this other stuff. But the hysteria that he's creating around this is creating this notion that Trump is trying to impart to people that this election was stolen from him. And you know for yourself, just in the way that, not everybody's going to be wrapped tight, that can create some really bad ends. What do you think?
I think this is going to sound pretty crass, and in some ways it is, but death threats go around a lot on the internet. Death threats are like some people's currency that they use when they're trying to get other people's attention. And they're just a lot of unhinged people in general. And, the internet, by democratizing communications, at least ostensibly, makes it a lot easier for the unhinged people to get access to the hinged people and make their lives miserable. That happens regardless. And I don't think that if you had another way to put this, yes, the Trump's language on this stuff is arguably unpresidential, and you can, justifiably say that he shouldn't be contesting it at this point, or that from the beginning it was baseless. But I think if you try to use that argument, the argument that, well, some people who listen to him as a massive public figure are acting because they believe him, that has a chilling effect in the long run on language or just things that people say in general. What's your take on that?
Oh, I think that's a good point. I mean, it's like if you're going to say we're going to have an internet and you're going to say people can get their point across, well, people are going to get their point across. And if those people are upset, they're going to get it across strongly. This went beyond that, though. Apparently, it was like death threats, like on the phone and those type of things. So it went beyond just the internet. But I get your point. That this is one of those things that it happens. Like it's
another way to look at this is if you criticize, and this is there are a couple of ways in which this is not morally equivalent to what we were just talking about, but I'm just trying to use it as a sort of toy example. If you start criticizing Neera Tanden or Tony Blinken, you start calling them war criminals, whatnot, and Tony Blinken specifically, and a clip of you doing that eloquently goes viral, and a bunch of people watch it, and some people send Tony Blinken death threats. Is that your fault? Or were you making a point that you thought was accurate, and other people who are unhinged acted on that in ways that you wouldn't have condoned or recommended? And does that actually rebut anything that you said? Does that mean that you shouldn't have said it? Or is that just something that other people are going to say because you're listened to, and there are crazy people in the world who listen to other people and will act on what they say? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, the logic commands itself. All of it happens. Meaning, it's true that if I say it and people listen to me, I could be flat fact accurate with everything I say. And people could take that, and you're right. They can go after him for it. They can send him death threats for it. Would it be my fault? To some degree, yeah. But to some degree, does that fault really belong to him since he's the one that was doing those things? That's also true. All of this stuff is true. And yeah, people who are for Blinken would say he's causing this. It's his fault, missing the fact and dropping the point that Blinken was a war criminal. You know what I mean? Like, it is true that just drawing a circle around it will bring people's eyes to it. And those people, some of them who might be unhinged, or some of them who might be hinged, might just want to rattle them, might send off those things. It's the way our society works, for better or for worse. Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate, right? It's like all of those things are logically following one another. It's like the moment one happens, all of the other stuff just happens almost. It's by a logic of its own. So, yeah, you're right. I agree. We have a caller.
Get a caller.
Yeah.
Let's go to Tarif.
What's going on, man?
All right, how y'all doing? I have 4 quick comments. Daryl Blocker might be the next head of the CIA. He's an African American. So what that means is they might try to bring Africa underneath the American wing, the Western wing, again underneath from China. That's my opinion. So they're gonna fight China on using other methods, I think. Black Lives Matter chapters is upset with Black Lives Matter Global that received the donations because now they starting to ask where the money's at. So they wrote a letter about it, and I shared the link with y'all. My third comment, Catherine Hickory, CBS. The DOJ spokesman said some media outlets are saying that investigation was concluded dealing with the election fraud from the DOJ. That's not true. It's a half-truth. There's still an investigation election fraud, but what happened is they have yet to see any election fraud to a massive scale election fraud up to this point, but they still collect evidence from it. So the investigation still is ongoing. And my fourth and last comment, Moore's Economy game changer. A new technology can extract water and fuel from salty water, a process that was discovered in Washington University, St. Louis, which is better than this other process that the land rovers used. It's called Moxie, which is 25 more better than that. But it can extract oxygen and fuel from the salty water, especially on Mars. Now, you might, in the future, you can see colonies on Mars.
Wait, you're talking about desalinization technologies where they can basically get rid of the salt so people can drink the water and basically use, the materials for other things. You're saying they have technology where they can get water and oxygen from it.
Yes, water and oxygen. I got the link so you can read them all. You were saying it's up to
fascinating
today. Yeah.
That's great recommendation there. Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, and specifically that last point that you brought up, not just for rovers, but for colonies, that's what you'd need. You need on-site oxygen production. Yeah. Otherwise, you'd constantly have to bring more in. And anyway, Tarif, thank you for the call. We got to go into a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back on the other side of this break in just a minute.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and our guest for this segment and the next, Dr. Lakisha Jenkins. Dr. Lakisha Jenkins is a traditional naturopath, registered master herbalist, and founding president of the California cannabis industry. Her core competencies include using herbs as the basis of nutrition to combat the symptoms of chronic, degenerative, and terminal illness. And by the way, you can follow her on Twitter at Dr. Lakisha and on our website, drlakisha.com. Lakisha, thank you for being with us. Or should I say Dr. Jenkins? Dr. Jenkins, thank you for being with us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm good, thank you. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Hey, thank you so much for being with us. All right. Last time we talked with you briefly, and I want to do an update at this point. We were talking about COVID and CBD and maybe just cannabis in general. But specifically about CBD and some of the other, I think it was some of the terpenes effects from the cannabis plant on COVID and on autoimmunity in general, on sort of the processes by which our body prevents itself from overreacting to what it perceives as foreign invaders, to these outside sources of stress, and that would include COVID-19, that would include other viruses. What does it do? Just let's try to come back to it from the sort of ground up. What at this point, looking at it, what does CBD do? Does it actually help folks with COVID? If so, how do you think that works? And what should people know if they're considering buying CBD or using CBD products as a preventative, if they're worried about getting COVID, or for that matter, other viruses, other illnesses? Dr. Jenkins.
Right. So if it's already taken hold, so if you already have a positive COVID diagnosis, then it would help with the inflammatory response. So actually suppressing the inflammatory response. One of the biggest threats actually to a COVID diagnosis is the symptom of having excess inflammation that causes damage to the lungs. It's really the inflammation and scarring that happens in the lungs that's the biggest culprit, and why people are succumbing to the actual virus itself. Those are the major reasons. When it comes to being a preventative, though, as I've said before in previous talks, our endogenous cannabinoid system, or ECS, the cannabinoid system that we have that speaks to the cannabis plant specifically, is actually a regulatory system. So it regulates things like our immune system and our inflammatory response. So if we're supporting it, thinking like nutritionally, so you're giving it all of the phytocannabinoids that are found in the plant, the terpenes that are found in the plant, and supporting it nutritionally, then you're actually able to make that regulatory system work a little bit more efficiently, for lack of a better term. So you can use it in both ways, if you've already have a COVID diagnosis, but then also as a preventative. But either way, it's regulating the inflammatory response and also helping to support the immune system.
I think I understand where you're coming from. So you're basically saying that it's not so much that the drug or that either marijuana or CBD or let's say the cannabinoids that's part of the products has an antibiotic property or antiviral property. It's more so that the secondary consequences of the virus itself are, let's say, diminished by the drug, by the CBD. So it's the inflammation response that is basically being attacked, not necessarily the disease directly. Am I understanding that correctly?
No, actually, it's a twofer. So if you think about CBD specifically, so just CBD, it's more of the inflammatory response and to help sort of suppress that inflammatory response and also helping with regulating the immune system. But there are definitely antiviral, antibacterial properties to phytocannabinoids, so the entire full spectrum, and that includes all of the cannabinoids. That also includes some of the synergistic action of the terpenes working with the cannabinoids. So it's both. If you're looking at a CBD supplement specifically, so isolated CBD, that's where you would be going with the help of the inflammation and also helping with the suppression of the immune system. If you're looking at a full spectrum supplement, so all of the CBDs, the CBGs, the CBNs, the THCAs even, all of those included, and the terpenes, you're also looking at not only the inflammation under control, the immune system being regulated, but you're looking at the antiviral and antibacterial and sometimes even antimicrobial properties of the full expression of the cannabis plant.
What the heck are we supposed to make? It's just from a broader sense. We have an endocannabinoid system. We have this system. It's a regulatory system like you're talking about. I've known about it for a long time, as most folks have. If you're familiar with this stuff, if you've ever smoked weed, often this is a talking point that people bring up. What are we supposed to make of the fact that our body has this regulatory system that, this specific plant seems to be able to tap into so well? And more broadly, how important is that system in our body's functioning and the way that our mind works, in our mood, in driving our behavior from all these different perspectives? What's the through line there, Lakisha?
So I think that we have to think of the fact that the endogenous cannabinoid system is one of the very first systems that's developed very early in gestational age. Then we also have to take into consideration the fact that all mammalian species and some invertebrates are actually equipped with this endogenous cannabinoid system. And I like to liken, cannabis and hemp as more of a nutritional supplement, so more of like a vegetable. Because if you think about anything that you consume to get the vitamins, minerals, amino acids that are required to sustain life, we're learning now that phytocannabinoids are also a very important part of that component, because our brain produces endocannabinoids naturally that mirror very closely in chemical composition the phytocannabinoids found in the cannabis and hemp plant. So we are really, what we should make of it is that we are hardwired. If this is a system that's developed very early in gestational age, if endocannabinoids are actually found in breast milk, which is like the elixir of life, we are hardwired to interact with this particular botanical that mirrors very closely in chemical composition what our brain does naturally, and can speak to the over 300 receptor sites that we have in our body that work, the CB1 and CB2 receptors that work to make up the endogenous cannabinoid system, which is the epicenter of homeostasis, so balance in the body, and regulates things such as I said, the immune system, inflammatory response, but also our cognitive function and cardiovascular system and digestive function. And there's so many systems, our endocrine system, that this particular endogenous cannabinoid system helps to regulate. We have to know that supplementing and supporting that system to work optimally is really what's best for human health.
That is very interesting. I remember the endocannabinoids. I may be pronouncing this wrong. I apologize. But this was being part of the brain, and this connection between marijuana and the items that were in marijuana and the way that it connects to the human being through certain receptors. Why do you think that's there like that? I mean, is it peculiar, or is it not peculiar? I mean, I guess I don't know enough about the topic in order to know one way or the other, but it seems very interesting to me that the human body has an affinity for this particular plant. I guess I'm leaving it kind of as an open question, but why?
Yeah, that's what we're aiming to find out. Unfortunately, the research is just not there. So, the discovery, they call it, of the endogenous cannabinoid system happened sometime in the early 60s, and actually like quantifying of the function of the endogenous cannabinoid system happened sometime in the 90s. So we're just not there with the research. And unfortunately, because of the scheduling of cannabis and cannabis derivatives, research is just not easy to get a hold of or even to be conducted. So the why, unfortunately, is a question that we just don't have an answer to right now. Even the how much, because as we know how much vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin E, those things that we need in our body, there aren't any tests that exist that say this is how many endogenous cannabinoids are in your body at any given time, and this is how much you need to support your endocannabinoid system to function properly. Unfortunately, that's where we're at a miss, and there's an educational disconnect. We need the research. We need to demand the research, actually, because we have learned that the endogenous cannabinoid system is definitely an important part of human health and function and physiology.
So say, in the simplest terms, and we've got a lot more to talk about on this, we're going up pretty close to a break here. Say I wanted to positively impact my endogenous cannabinoid system. Say I wanted to supplement, but I don't want to get high. I don't want to smoke weed. I don't want to take edibles. I don't want to do that stuff because I want, the clarity of mind, et cetera. Just hold that for a second. How do I do that? Is it just CBD? Would there be terpenes that you would throw in there? Are there other things that would, be useful for that? Or is it really just CBD? Dr. Jenkins.
So really, whole plant medicine is the best solution. We don't know enough, again, as I said before, because of the research about the endogenous cannabinoid system, to really isolate constituents. So CBD is an isolate. It's an isolated cannabinoid. It's one of the hundreds of cannabinoids that are found, in botanicals such as cannabis. So to isolate the one or two, and say that these are specific ones or what's best, to support that system, we're just not there yet. So my short answer would be, whatever whole plant medicine. So the buzzword that they use, in the industry when it comes to supplements, it's full spectrum. So as much of a full spectrum supplement that you can get, that usually says that it includes the cannabinoids, the terpenes, sometimes flavonoids and lipids, depending on the blend. You're getting more of a full expression of the plant. Because of rules and regulations and laws, sometimes you're not able to actually access a full spectrum supplement. If you can't, CBD happens to be one of those supplements that you can get just about anywhere in all 50 states. So if all you can get is CBD, definitely go for it and use that as a supplement. And there's no psychoactivity usually found in any of those products, especially if it's an isolate, so you don't have to worry about the high. Another thing that I like to say is even in a full spectrum product, THC, the cannabinoid that we all think is about, getting you high, has an acid chain attached to it when it's raw. So that acid chain actually blocks the receptor for psychoactivity. If you're using a raw ingestible supplement that hasn't had, any heat processing or anything, the chances of having that psychoactivity take effect are very, very, very low.
Interesting. So you can't. Dr. Lakisha, sorry, we got to go up to a break. But real quick, you're saying if you take it raw, you will potentially get the positive effects on your endocannabinoid system without the psychoactive component. Is that broadly right?
Absolutely. That's absolutely correct. Yes. Interesting.
I'm very, very curious about this. I'd also like to hear more specifically about the whole sativa indica divide, whether there's one that you'd recommend over the other for medical reasons on the other side of the break. But we're heading up against a break here. You guys are listening to the voice of Dr. Lakisha Jenkins, traditional naturopath, registered master herbalist, and founding president of the California cannabis industry. Her core competencies include using herbs as the basis of nutrition to combat the symptoms of chronic, degenerative, and terminal illness. We'll be back with her in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. Don't surrender.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and our guest, Dr. Lakisha Jenkins. She is a traditional naturopath, registered mastered herbalist, and founding president of the California cannabis industry. Her core competencies include using herbs as the basis of nutrition to combat the symptoms of chronic, degenerative, and terminal illness. And by the way, you can and should follow Dr. Lakisha on Twitter at Dr. Lakisha. Also check out her website, drlakisha.com. Thank you again for being with us. I asked a quick question on the other side of the break, and then I also kind of cut you off. So just following up at this point, sativa or indica, or for that matter, ruderalis, which is a much
here,
less
by the
known.
Way. Just to interrupt, Team Sativa. Team Sativa.
I was historically a sativa guy as well. Yeah, indica is a little bit too heavy. But Dr. Jenkins, what's your take here?
So that was really, the elementary definitions that were given to, the cannabis plant on being able to differentiate the varieties of it. So they say, with the sativas, it's more of an uplifting, sort of cerebral sort of effect. With the indicas, it's more of a body, couch lock sort of effect. But what we really need to start dialing in on now that more research and information is coming out is the cannabinoid profile. You really want to know more than anything, what is the actual blend of cannabinoids that are found in here? Besides it being a sativa or indica, we're finding that the various levels of THC, CBD, CBN, CBG, all of those in the way that they play together, even with terpenes, are giving very condition-specific or desired outcome effects. So yes, sativa and indica are the basis definitions that we've used, previously in the past, but we need to start focusing more on cannabinoid profiles, so the actual percentages of cannabinoids that are found in this. And according to, the research that is out there, what those cannabinoids are good for, and then using that to sort of determine our desired outcome, without being too scientific about it. But it is becoming one of those scientific things.
Yeah, it does seem to be, for people who live in Maryland, or don't live in Maryland, I should say, you can get a card here. And the breakdown and the science of the stuff is phenomenal. And you're right, it does seem like the cannabinoids and the various products in it have a larger effect than just the THC by itself. Because you can have something that has like a lower THC but has a pronounced effect in regards to, let's say, energy, or let's say euphoria, point of view, those type of things. Northern Lights, for example. Northern Lights, indica, but it comes across as a cerebral, experience. And so it does. It's fascinating. I'm glad you said that, because that was one of those things that I came across and I experienced myself. One of the things I do want to get into before you leave, though, has to do with COVID and pregnancy, and how CBD, or for that matter, marijuana, may interact during those items. Now, I don't know if marijuana during pregnancy is allowed in the same way that cigarettes. I don't necessarily know the processing of it. But CBD should be fine with it. What are the effects from the standpoint of CBD in pregnancy, and even CBD in pregnancy and protecting against COVID itself?
So I will give some personal testimony, because I just happened to, in May, give birth to a baby during this.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Jeez.
That's right.
Thank you. During this global pandemic, and actually utilized phytocannabinoid supplements during my pregnancy. I absolutely did. Because again, as I said, the endocannabinoid system is developed very early in gestational age, and there's endocannabinoids found in breast milk. So, babies get that as a supplement, if they're breastfed anyway. So when it comes to pregnancy, your immune system is already, sort of suppressed in different ways when you're going through pregnancy. You have a lot of pregnancy symptoms such as nausea, and vomiting, the morning sickness, those types of things that actually phytocannabinoid supplements help very much for, and sometimes in better and safe, ways than some of the pharmaceuticals that are offered out there, for those same symptoms. During COVID, specifically, I think there is a certain level of immune system suppression and maybe a little bit of protection for pregnant mothers, but using, again, a CBD supplement to help with that inflammation, if you were to get a COVID diagnosis, or even as a preventative, would definitely be beneficial. Supplementing your endogenous cannabinoid system at all times, even during pregnancy, is very beneficial. The question that you want to answer, and as this is what I was saying before, but when I was cut off, is what product, in what dose, and what delivery method? Those are the questions that you have to answer. So when you take into consideration, pregnancy, of course, it's a little bit different product, different dose, different delivery method. But should you be taking it? My advice, barring any, problems with your pregnancy or any, adverse information that you get from your general healthcare professional, yes, I believe that supplementing during pregnancy is very, very beneficial for a number of reasons, and even more so if during this global pandemic time, with the research that's out there about cannabinoids actually being able to help the number of receptor sites that COVID can even take hold, be lower. I think that type of supplement is very, very important. Of course, take the advice of your healthcare professional, but from the naturopath and, sort of holistic nutrition and herbalist standpoint, I am all for it.
And how about delivery mechanism? I want to come back to this for a second. You're talking about delivery mechanism there. You have smoking, you have vaping, you have distillates of various extracts, and then you just have dry vaping, where you have the herb itself and you're vaporizing that. And then you have edibles of different types, et cetera. What would you recommend for the medical benefits particularly, Dr. Jenkins?
For the medical benefits particularly, I would definitely recommend ingesting. But most of our endocannabinoid system receptors are found in our brain and in our gut. That's the highest concentration. So actually ingesting it, having it go through your digestive system hits more of those receptor sites. So I would be definitely a fan of that. With that being said, some edibles are hard to dial in on dosage because you have to cut it in different pieces. So I'm more of a proponent of a sublingual, like a tincture, because you can dial in the exact number of drops that you need and equate that with how many milligrams of a cannabinoid or terpene you're getting specifically and come up with a specific dose. Now, if you don't like tinctures, whatever your preferred delivery method is, my advice would be use that. If you're going to choose supplementing as opposed to not supplementing, pick your favorite delivery method and your favorite product and supplement, because it's important that you do that part. But I'm definitely a fan of ingesting, and that's what I use personally, tinctures, sublingual tinctures myself, because I can dial in the dosage very specifically.
Dr. Jenkins, we have about 5 minutes left. I want to make a slight pivot, even though it's not necessarily out of context in regards to what we're talking about. The high itself. When people are experiencing the high, when they're feeling euphoric, when they're feeling energetic, when they're feeling, let's say, happy, or introspective, when they start digging into these kind of aspects of humanity or whatever, when they're feeling it in that particular moment, what is actually taking place in the brain at that point? And why does the person or the individual experience it? I mean, ultimately, we're talking about matter that under normal circumstances is inert, that is experiencing and is not just giving a world, but giving color to that world, and to some degree is changing the tenor of the individual's consciousness as it pertains to that world. What is happening internally in the brain when that person is experiencing that high?
So I think there's multiple factors going on. The fact that, endocannabinoids or the phytocannabinoids found in the cannabis plant have been found to be neuroregenerative and neuroprotective. So it actually helps, in a lot of instances, connect those electronic, fires that are happening in the brain at all times and helping them to work more efficiently. And that's a way, in the most elementary terms, that it helps to affect cognitive function. But I think more than anything, we found nutritionally that, certain foods that you eat or, certain substances that you ingest can actually cause like brain fog and help to decrease your cognitive function. When you think about utilizing a phytocannabinoid supplement nutritionally, more of what it's doing is creating that balance. Because it's a regulatory system, it's helping everything to perform more optimally. And that includes your brain, and that includes cognition. But it also includes the fact that sometimes things don't work as well because the energy for that is going to do something else. If you're supplementing the system and everything's in balance, then everything is just working at optimum performance. So I think, sans the research to say specifically why, it's more of that overall homeostasis or balance that it brings to the system and optimal performance. And to tell you the truth, I think we're all used to living with some level of dysfunction, and we just don't even know what it's like to function normally with no pain, no stress, no issues. So when you bring on this supplement that helps to bring that balance, everything is heightened and more aware, and you're more awake.
How about from the perspective, we've only got a minute or two left, but for people who are not just interested in consuming this, but growing it, if they're going to choose strains, if you're looking at a collection of seeds and you're trying to determine what would be the most useful for different types of ailments specifically, any kind of, we've got only so much time here, but any kind of guidelines going into it that you'd recommend for growers, Dr. Jenkins?
Yes, definitely check your soil and your microclimate, because your end product is definitely going to be affected by your growing medium and environment. So start there and research there. What's optimal for your growing conditions, for your growing medium? What is optimal there? But from there, it's really about what your desired outcomes are. If you want to produce a product that's for this specific medical market that can do this specific thing, check the cannabinoid profile again, so the actual profile of the plant, and grow those cultivars. There's a lot of information out there now on which cannabinoids are good for which, specific symptoms. Find out what your...
Where would you, real quick, look, Dr. Jenkins, where would you recommend people go to check out? You're talking about a lot of information out there. Any websites or directories, things like that you'd recommend people check out?
Yes. So for research specifically, there's a lot out there on the National Institutes of Health on specific cannabinoids and what they're good for. And there's another website that's out there. It's research out of Israel, actually, that has a full database. I can't recall the website specifically right now, but it's a full database of all cannabinoids and what they're good for.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, giving some people some leads to follow up with their own research. Just like to do that. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having
those
me.
Listening. Yeah, thank you. Dr. Lakisha Jenkins is a traditional naturopath, registered master herbalist, and founding president of the California cannabis industry. You guys have been listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We'll be back in just a minute with headlines.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for our last hour today of the most disruptive show covering news and events across those states as well as across our divided globe. And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
Together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And in the news this morning, going straight into headlines, Britain has become the first country in the West to approve a COVID-19 vaccine for public use. The UK Department of Health and Social Care confirmed in a statement to British news agencies that the vaccine developed jointly by American drug maker Pfizer and Germany's BioNTech would be distributed starting next week. Pfizer was the first of three major Western pharmaceutical companies to apply in both the US and Europe for emergency use authorization. In line with planning in the U.S., British frontline healthcare workers, care home residents, the very elderly, and people with underlying conditions that make them particularly vulnerable to COVID-19 complications are expected to get the first doses of the vaccine. Pfizer's vaccine, like the Oxford and Moderna formulas, requires 2 doses about a month apart. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, that's the CDC folks, is reducing the number of days one should quarantine after being exposed to the coronavirus from 14 days to 7 to 10 days. That's cutting it almost in half. Dr. Robert Redfield, director of the CDC, made the announcement during a coronavirus task force meeting on Tuesday. Dr. Redfield informed Vice President Mike Pence and the White House coronavirus task force team that the CDC will be issuing new orders on the number of days that a person who has been in direct contact with the virus should quarantine, quote unquote, soon. New guidelines coming out soon. They will recommend that someone who has been exposed or had close contact with the virus should quarantine for 7 to 10 days. Again, that's less than the originally recommended 14 days or 2 weeks. According to the new guidelines, the individual can end their quarantine after 7 days if they get a negative on a COVID-19 test or about 10 days into it without a test. And reportedly, they're doing this because even though you can, there's some chance that you can spread the sickness, you can spread COVID in that 10 to 14 day period, that far out, they're saying that it's just too stringent. So people are unlikely to follow the recommendations if you're asking them to isolate for that long. People are more likely to follow the recommendations if you're asking for less. And they sort of just determined that's about the right length of time. That's the sort of cutting the middle of the road there. President Trump, in our next headline, tweeted late Tuesday that he will veto the National Defense Authorization Act unless Congress repeals Section 230 of the 1996 Communications Decency Act, which critics say unfairly shields social media platforms from liability over items posted on their platforms. These opponents have been vocal that tech behemoths like Twitter and Facebook should no longer be shielded as a neutral platform when they operate more like a publisher. The criticism seemed to reach its tipping point during the Hunter Biden scandal in the weeks prior to the presidential election. The New York Post ran an explosive report that showed emails from Hunter Biden linking his father to his Ukraine business dealing and other media of Hunter Biden's showing illicit behavior by the president-elect's son. Republican Senators Ted Cruz, Lindsey Graham, and Josh Hawley called on the heads of Twitter and Facebook at the time to testify. And they did testify, although I'll point this out. The Republicans, when they were, this was ostensibly about Section 230 when they called the folks up, but it was mostly like an optical sort of press show where they were just haranguing them and kind of insulting them. And again, I'll repeat what I said a couple hours ago. I don't really blame them for it. There's some satisfaction in seeing very powerful people who've done some bad things being brought before the court of, political opinion and, harangued, insulted, etc. On the other hand, it wasn't that substantive. And this was just before the election. Arguably, it's more to get those politicians reelected than it's anything to actually make a change. And again here, Jamarl, Trump is holding the National Defense Authorization Act hostage, so to speak. He's, that's his bargaining chip here. I think that's going to hit certain people in the military-industrial complex very hard. And for me personally, there's nothing I'd rather see held hostage here than that. But on the other hand, isn't it kind of a degradation of our political system that, like, in order to make progress in one area, you've got to slow progress in another area? Isn't that itself a sign of political stagnation? Like, that seems like a relatively inefficient way to handle political grievances, although, you got to do what you got to do given the times as they are. But Jamarl, what's your take?
I think that's a prescient point. I mean, if you think back to Republicans when they were trying to stop Obama from doing whatever Obama wanted to do, what did they do? Debt ceiling. That quirk of the law. We spend money in the government, and then we have to appropriate the money after we spend it to be paid. And so they were able to use that to basically stop Obama from doing anything. Meaning, it's like saying, so the months were basically eaten up with this, are we going to go over the fiscal cliff? Are we going to go over the fiscal cliff? When Donald Trump takes office, $9 trillion, almost instantly, that they add to the debt ceiling. But again, the point, in order to stop Obama, they basically use something like that in order to drag him down to prevent him from doing whatever modest, incremental thing he was going to do. And right here, Trump, same thing. Trump did the same thing, if you remember, with the airline workers, the people who were working for like the TSA and whatnot. When he was like, if you don't give me the money to build a wall, I'm not going to give these people their money. And you're like, what? And so between the National Defense Authorization Act being the hostage and real human beings not getting their paychecks, I'm okay with this. Even though, like I said, the UFO part of it is in it. But yeah, I agree with you. I mean, like, of all the hostages you can take, you take the defense industry. Okay.
Yeah. If you look at where the Treasury spends its money, a lot of those bucks go to lining the pockets of the military industrial complex's defense contractors. And so, it's a lot of money that's being withheld there. Again, I think if you're going to try to make the various members of the hidden establishment cry uncle, that's probably the most effective way to do it. So hat off to you in that sense, Donald Trump. All of our other problems with you aside. The Justice Department is investigating a bribery scheme that directed money to the White House or used political contributions in exchange for a presidential pardon. According to court documents released Tuesday, the district court in Washington, D.C. released 20 pages of heavily redacted documents that do not identify who is being investigated nor the timing of the alleged scheme. The government's motion was initially submitted to Chief Judge Beryl A. Howell under seal in order to obtain permission to review certain attorney-client communications prosecutors believe proved potential quote-unquote criminal activity. A filter team working on behalf of the government. This is not Tarif Simon's kind of filter team. This is another kind of filter team. was going through several terabytes of data they had seized from over 50 electronic devices, such as iPhones, iPads, laptops, thumb drives, and hard drives. Prosecutors asked the court for permission to review email communications they believe revealed a, quote, bribery conspiracy scheme in which Redacted would offer a substantial political contribution in exchange for a presidential pardon or reprieve of sentence for Redacted, end quote. I can't help but think that you can, you know who that second Redacted is. You're darn sure that's Donald Trump. On Tuesday evening, after the release of the court document, an official with the Justice Department sought to tamp down speculation about who might be a target in the probe. The official said that, quote, no government official was or is currently a subject or target of the investigation disclosed in this filing, end quote. So, that locks out a certain number of people. The bribery scheme has to do with Donald Trump in some sense, but it's not like they're investigating Trump or any other government officials. Doesn't mean they're not investigating Trump associates who aren't parts of the government. Anyway, in our next headline, in a breakthrough a month after deadly conflict cut off Ethiopia's Tigray region from the world, the United Nations on Wednesday said it and the Ethiopian government have signed a deal to allow, quote unquote, unimpeded humanitarian access, at least for areas under federal government control, after the Prime Minister's declaration of victory over the weekend. This will allow the first food, medicines, and other aid into the region of 6 million people that has seen rising hunger during the fighting between the federal and Tigray regional governments. Each regards the other as illegal in a power struggle that has been months in the making. For weeks, the UN and others have pleaded for access amid reports of supplies running desperately low for millions of people. A UN humanitarian spokesman, Sabiano Abru, said the first mission to carry out a needs assessment would begin on Wednesday. In Singapore, the government has given regulatory approval for the world's first clean meat, quote unquote, that does not come from slaughtered animals. I just want to point out the use of the term clean meat is that, it's the use of language where you're trying to give people a certain impression of something. It's emotionally coded language, basically. Like Frank Luntz on the Republican side or George Lakoff on the Democrat side. They sort of, they didn't coin it. They didn't invent this stuff. But as far as I can tell, they are the two key figures who've been identified with this kind of language, with this coded kind of language. Just pointing that out for folks. Anyway, this decision from Singapore paves the way for San Francisco-based startup Eat Just to sell lab-grown chicken meat. The meat will initially be used in nuggets, but the company hasn't said when they will become available. Demand for alternatives to regular meat has surged due to consumer concerns about health, animal welfare, and the environment. According to Barclays, the market for meat alternatives could be worth $140 billion or 104 billion pounds within the next decade. That's about 10% of the $1.4 trillion global meat industry. The company called it a breakthrough for the global food industry and hopes other countries will now follow suit. Over the last decade, dozens of startups have attempted to bring cultured meat to the market, hoping to win over conventional meat eaters with the promise of a more ethical product. Two of the largest are Israel-based Future Meat Technologies and the Bill Gates-backed Memphis Meats, which are both trying to enter the market with affordable and quote-unquote tasty lab-grown meats. Singapore's Shiok Meats is working on lab-grown crustacean meats. Somehow that's the worst of all possible lab-grown meats. Lab-grown crustacean meats just absolutely terrifies me. Anyway, while many have touted the environmental benefits, some scientists have suggested it might be worse for climate change under some circumstances. Depending on how much electricity they're using, where that electricity is coming from. I could see that. Seems the most plausible thing here. You don't think so, Jamarl?
I don't know if I see that one. I mean, because if you think of cows in the way that we do our animal agriculture amounts for almost half of climate change. And it depends on, like you said, where they get the energy from. But if they're, if they get energy from clean sources, it seems that takes it away. Even if they got it from regular sources, it seems like that would still be better. But I could be wrong. I mean, maybe they're right. Maybe, depending upon the way they use the energy in that thing, it creates a different differential of it's like, okay, we're good in one sense, but bad in the other. But can I just point out, Jamarl, that sounds so gross to me. Like every time I hear lab grown.
It sounds gross to me too.
Say it again. Say it one more time.
No, I'm sorry, man. I just wanted to disagree with you. Cows are not responsible for half of climate change. If you're looking and this is even more complicated because you need to get into like the conversation about methanotrophs and various bacteria that would eat the methane that cows release. Cows are responsible for like 10% of all methane emissions in the U.S. alone. If you're just looking at the U.S., and obviously we produce a lot of cows, therefore we produce a lot of manure, which is where the methane comes from. Most of it's coming from like other kinds of fermentation, from landfills, from natural gas and petroleum systems. I'm looking at a pie chart right now that I can send to you.
Yes, send a pie chart.
And then that's just methane. I'll send it to you. That's just methane. And there's also carbon dioxide. I understand. Before it.
But animal agriculture. I mean, when I'm saying cows, I'm saying animal agriculture. But I'm saying a significant percentage. If I'm not mistaken, half. I'm standing by that number for right now until I get the opportunity to kind of fact check this. But fair enough. If you're sending me a thing that says something otherwise, fair enough. But I guess I'm making the point that it's significant. Let's agree on that part. It's still a significant amount of greenhouse. And look, like you say, change the animal feed. You can change the levels of methane and so forth that comes out because that stuff comes out either in the way they belch or the manure, et cetera, et cetera. So fair enough. I don't know. 100%. But to jump from that part, because I could be wrong on that, then you might be right. This sounds so gross to me. It's like lab-grown meat, or like you said, lab-grown crustaceans. It sounds like the worst of both worlds. I get the ethical argument, and fair enough. I would even make the ethical argument. Even on Star Trek, that's not real meat. That's not a real cow. They're pulling that stuff together in molecules. But the growing it in the lab just sounds, it makes my skin crawl. Because at that point, it's like, growing from what? What are they growing this from? Like, is this like cells?
It's in, petri dish meat. To use the opposite of, they use the phrase clean meat. That's sort of their marketing term. Yeah. I'll use the term petri dish meat to try to scare people out of eating this. No, I'm just kidding. Here's the thing, man. I knew we'd get caught up in this. I wanted to go through a couple of more headlines. We really only have time for one. I'm gonna get back to the headlines for a second, and then maybe we can come back to this at the end of the hour, or with Dr. Bill, frankly, if he's open to it. But in any event, last headline here: a bear biologist teamed up with 2 Silicon Valley-based tech workers and created Bear ID, which uses facial recognition software to monitor grizzly bears. So far, the project has used AI to recognize 132 of the animals individually, while facial recognition technology is known as a tool for identifying humans, and a controversial one at that, due to a spate of well-known issues regarding privacy, accuracy, and bias. Bear ID is one of several efforts to adapt it for animals in the wild and on farms. Proponents of the technology say it's a cheaper, longer-lasting, and less invasive way to track animals than, say, attaching a collar or piercing an ear to attach an RFID tag. Pretty soon, the bears are going to be wearing camo just to try to evade our detection. They're going to be painting each other with face paint. I know that's what we would do. I can only anthropomorphize them and assume they'd do the same. That's fake news, folks. You're listening to Fault Lines. Those are our headlines on Fault Lines. And with that confusing turn of phrase, I will take us into a break. We'll be back in just a minute with Dr. Bill Honigman, retired emergency room physician and progressive healthcare activist. Again, you've been listening to Headlines on Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones with the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host, Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also kicking around in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. You can also reach us with a chat, a tweet, and of course, by phone at 202-521-1320. But joining us now is retired emergency room physician, progressive healthcare activist, and national outreach director at Progressive Democrats of America, Dr. Bill Honigman. Dr. Bill, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much. Great to be here.
Absolutely. So, question for you. First, before we get into anything contentious, if indeed it may be contentious, I just want to ask, how was your Thanksgiving? How was your holidays? I hope you had a good one.
Pretty good, thanks. What did we do? We had pizza for Thanksgiving. It was the most unconventional Thanksgiving I think I've ever experienced in all of my 67 years.
There's nothing wrong with that. It's
hopefully not lab-grown pizza.
Yeah, I know, I know, right? You know, this Thanksgiving was so bizarre because, you know, we're stuck in the house. I personally don't want to take any chances. My wife don't want to take chances. 2020 is basically trying to take me out already, so let's not do that. Let's not take that chance. So we stayed at home. And, you know, my grandmother was ill, so my mom was with her. It's like everyone was in their enclaves. And my wife, she fixes dinner like a family was coming over. I mean, nails it. And so it was a really bizarre Thanksgiving, but it still felt like home. So, yeah, it was very strange. Let me ask you this. Let's get into Biden's picks. Now, I was one of those people that believe that Biden should be pushed. That if you're going to be in an election, the last thing that you want is for that election to get inverted. Meaning the responsibility of the candidate to get the votes as opposed to people throwing themselves at the candidate and tongue lashing people who, for whatever particular reason, didn't feel that they needed to support your candidate. So that's where we were. And so Biden basically gets in office without necessarily needing to promise anything significant, especially once he got out of the primaries. The picks. Lefties have been howling at the picks. Rahm Emanuel, Neer Tanden, not to mention the people who he's putting in Secretary of State. Like, these picks are problematic, to put it mildly. How do you frame this? I frame this as Biden doesn't really care what progressives think, and he's putting them on notice right off the bat. How do you frame Joe Biden's picks for his cabinet and for his administration? And one secondary question to that, does Neer Tanden get confirmed?
Yeah. So I'm right there with you. I just have a super high level of concern over the picks so far. First of all, Jamarl, most of us aren't going after Biden until he actually takes office. I mean, we got to get, the guy who currently is occupying the Oval Office out of there. And then a whole lot of us are, of course, concerned with the possibility, at least, of still trying to turn the Senate and the two runoffs in Georgia. So a whole lot of us are still focused on those efforts. But the picks so far, at least as far as I know, Rahm Emanuel has not been selected for anything. That would be a disaster if he had been. It's just rumored so far, and even some disastrous other picks, like, for example, Michelle Flournoy as Secretary of Defense is still rumored so far. I mean, Antony Blinken as Secretary of State is bad, according to most of us, most progressives who are watching foreign policy picks would agree as well. But I mean, if you just start kind of at the beginning with the transition team, Ron Klain, for example, as White House Chief of Staff, he of course was directed efforts against Ebola most of us don't have a problem with Ron Klain. Cedric Richmond, before him, of course, was a Congress member in Louisiana, very corporate connected guy. Was picked as co-chair of the transition team, I think, even months ago. That, of course, drew a lot of red flags from progressives. And what's kind of near and dear to my heart really are the healthcare picks. You have people like Vivek Murthy and David Kessler, not very controversial, but then you have Ezekiel Emanuel and Atul Gawande, who are healthcare champions, but not fans of Medicare for all, and have been, publicly on record as such. So those are of big concern to me. On the economy side, near tangent is awful. Is just awful. So we're in that respect, it looks a lot like Obama pulling in all of the corporate enemies into the tent. We all thought, well, he's pulling his keep your enemies closer, your friends closer, enemies closer. Maybe that's what he's doing. Wrong. He actually brought them all into the tent, as his friends, not his enemies. So in that respect, I'm right there with you.
And so I'm gonna jump in here, and I don't mean to grill you or make this a 2 versus 1 thing, Dr. Bill, but I can't help but agree with Jamarl in a broad sense that now that Biden's the president-elect, now that he appears prepared to sit in the Oval Office for the coming 4 years, assuming he can make it that far, now that that's all in place, what leverage do progressives, does the quote-unquote real left here, what leverage do they actually have? What can you do about it? I mean, isn't this one of these cases where they've sort of gotten what they wanted out of the electorate, and now they have free reign to do what they will, which for the most part will be ill. It won't be doing much good from what you're saying. What can you do now? And if you're going to learn something from this, not you specifically, but the progressive left in general, what should it be, Dr. Bill?
Well, it's a great question, Shane. And, I've been doing this a while. I'm no spring chicken. So, that's why I've chosen in myself my own activism and advocacy to organize for a group like Progressive Democrats America. I mean, we take it to the streets when we have to. So we're inside and outside of the Democratic Party. So we're inside the party to reform the Democratic Party. We're outside the party when the party's not going along with us. So, in an off season, we're working on structural reform within the party as well as pushing the issues on the street. Now, sometimes you see it erupt in the form of something like, the Occupy movement, which a lot of people think, oh, well, it didn't go anywhere. Well, actually, it did. It changed a lot of hearts and minds. Started talking about the 99%. It built the opportunity for Bernie Sanders to rise up and, actually create a movement, especially among youth and people of color. So, I mean, the leverage is in messaging on the issues and then going into the next political cycle. And that's what we're talking about. More people getting involved in having a participatory democracy. And Biden has to consider that part of his base. Kamala Harris has to consider that part of her base, because she is, the de facto leader of the Democratic Party, because most of us don't see Biden as going a second term.
Dr. Honigman, I got to be honest. I don't see where Biden or Kamala Harris needs to care about any of that stuff. At the end of the day, they were able to get 14 million more votes than Hillary Clinton without offering anything other than we're not Trump. I mean, in real terms, 88% of the Democratic Party wanted Medicare for all. 74%, if I'm not mistaken, on the election night on Fox News wanted it. At the very least, more than 70%. And yet, during a pandemic, progressives, the left, could not get that over the finish line. And I think that's something, that's something endemic of weakness. And I think part of that weakness is because at the end of the day, it always boils down to you have nowhere else to go, whereas mainstream or corporate Democrats always do. They could take it or leave it. I mean, if they leave it, Nancy Pelosi still has $100 million in the bank. By the same token, the other people that are going to get hit from not even the incrementalism stuff, those people suffer. I guess I'm making the point that it's almost like and tell me what you think about it. Until African Americans, the left, and even some Democrats that are socialist curious get to the point where they're willing to let the Democrats fail, and they say no, nothing fundamentally changes because they can always go to the mat of you have nowhere else to go. Like I'm making a point that is somewhat of a scam in the way that it gets people and keeps them trapped within the context of the party. Do you think I'm right on that? We have 2 minutes and we can open it up. But let's do this. Let's end this. Let's close this segment early, and we'll just open it up a little bit early on the other side. But I do want you to think about it. Am I right that until people deal with that you have nowhere else to go stuff, nothing fundamentally changes in our politics? You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Joining us is Dr. Bill Honigman, retired emergency room physician, progressive healthcare activist, and national outreach director of Progressive Democrats of America.org. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you out of our station in D.C. Joining us is Dr. Bill Honigman, retired emergency room physician, progressive healthcare activist, and national outreach director at Progressive Democrats of America. Dr. Honigman, before we left, I was making this argument that basically the thing that plagues the left is this idea that it is their responsibility to throw themselves to Democrats. Democrats understand this and rationally take advantage, be it the left, be it African Americans. And they can always go to this notion of you have nowhere else to go. Biden said it multiple times. Someone will bring up Medicare for all, go vote for the other guy. They will bring up climate, go vote for the other guy. So until that edifice is broken, it seems like the left will always be stuck in this position of weakness and basically an inability to get things done despite the public agreeing with its ideas. What do you think about it?
Well, thanks, Jamarl. It's a great question, and I think that until we have a parliamentary system, we're kind of stuck with this two-party system, either or. And we had to get rid of Donald Trump. And one thing that the Trump Fox News machine did was create a populist movement and based on what they thought would appeal to their base, and it worked. I mean, we saw Trump banners and flags and stuff all over neighborhoods we didn't see before. So I think that's the lesson of this last election cycle, that even corporate Democrats need to get on board with. In other words, the money side of the Democratic Party needs to wake up and figure out that they almost lost this one too, and the reason is that there are really two forces in politics. There's the money and the people. And if they don't listen more to the people and use that force for reform inside the Democratic Party, they're going to lose again to the Republicans in the next election cycle. So that's really what we're talking about here.
I can't help but think that they're not going to learn from this. I can't help but think that they haven't learned from this. They're probably going to continue to blame progressives for the actions of the small margin of progressives who didn't vote for Biden, who were refusing to vote for Biden on moral and political grounds. They're probably going to blame that crowd for not coming out to vote to a wider extent. And I mean, to be frank, just backing up for a second, looking at Trump as this juxtaposed boogeyman set up against Biden. If you look at who Biden's bringing into his administration, who's going to be a part of his cabinet, Blinken, you mentioned Neera Tanden, a bunch of folks that progressives wouldn't like, but that frankly a lot of people wouldn't like across the country. Isn't this just going to be like the military-industrial complex party, and making questionable progress on domestic policy and clearly a step backwards for our foreign policy? It seems to me like we're setting ourselves. I mean, if you look at where we spend our money, if you look at where the government spends its money, certainly where it chooses to focus its attention and its resources, a lot of this is just on maintaining our hegemony overseas. And isn't that I just see that as this crucial outlay of attention and expenditure that keeps us from making substantial progress when it comes to what's good for Americans back at home. It seems like as a prerequisite for solving a lot of our domestic problems, you'd have to reduce our expenses overseas. And broadly, you'd have to combat, frankly, the military-industrial complex as a whole. Trump is the closest president. He's the president who came closest to doing that in decades. And he did not, I'm not saying he did a good job, but I really can't think of any, if you look back at the past 5 or 6 presidents or more, I can't think of anybody who's really tried to do that. In other words, is Trump is set up as this boogeyman, and there's a lot to hate about him, sure. But is he actually worse than Biden? What was actually on the line here for a lot of folks? It seems like, with 2020, it was apocalyptic, years of fear-mongering about this stuff. But is Biden actually better? I want to hear your take, Dr. Honigman. What do you think?
Yeah, Biden's better. No doubt in my mind, although you might say only marginally, but I was right there with you until we brought in Trump. So my concerns, my red flags, are with people like Neera Tanden and Michelle Flournoy. And, Michelle Flournoy, as a prospect for Secretary of Defense, takes me right to that the foreign policy that dumps incredible sums of money, overseas into these missions of regime change operations, takes it out of domestic into foreign, which is entirely the wrong, completely the wrong priority, especially in this situation of COVID and the needs here at home. And then the other appointment, is Neera Tanden, because she is, going to be at the Office of Management and Budget, which is the purse strings, basically, of the country. So I'm right there with you on that. But I would tell you there's no doubt in my mind that Trump was worse, that we were seeing no prioritization of funding for, this healthcare emergency that we're dealing with now. We're seeing no funding for all of the testing and contact tracing and even the treatment, at warp speed. I was really, when I heard that term warp speed, I thought, really warp speed with what? What resources are you going to put into delivering the vaccine to people? Because we certainly haven't seen any warp speed for PPE for our frontline providers. We're woefully behind still on testing our people across the country. I know nurses who treat patients who treat COVID-19 patients on a daily basis who still haven't been tested. So, how about warp speed for some of that? So, Trump is worse, and I'm sure that we're going to be doing better on all of those priorities, even domestic and foreign, although I still have my concerns about these picks. And we're going to push Biden as soon as he's in office, or even now we're already pushing him. But, like I say, we need to go step by step here.
Dr. Honigman, what about those people who make this point? This is liberals seem to be hypocritical in the way that they look at Trump and the way they look at Biden. That basically, from a domestic front, you may be right. When you get into foreign policy, well, not so much. Obama started multiple wars. The war in Syria by itself cost 500,000 lives. And Syria and Libya, oh God, they're selling slaves. Obama's policies in the Middle East set the Middle East on fire, even beyond George Bush, despite the fact that he got the Nobel Peace Prize. If we're looking at life as being important, the drone bombings, the killings in Yemen, the using of starvation, Obama knew this stuff was going to be bad. He signed off on it anyway. I guess I'm saying the people who are making this argument, they're saying, yes, on the domestic front, you may be right. But on the foreign policy front, Trump didn't start any more wars. How do you reconcile the two, let's say one on domestic and the other one being better on foreign policy, and coming away with a consensus conclusion that either Trump is better or Biden is better? I think you would probably still say Biden is better.
Yeah, I'm right there with you, except I'll give you two instances, okay? Iran nuclear deal and Paris Climate Accord. There's two of them for okay, let's say also,
I do agree with those, by the way.
Netanyahu, right? So, Trump's best buddy in Israel. These are awful. These are awful foreign policy decisions. Here's another one. We're no longer with the World Health Organization. Give me a break. So those are awful decisions. Okay, let's throw in North Korea while we're at it. So Trump was terrible on foreign policy, which leads me always to the conclusion that he's a Russian oligarch wannabe. That's really what he aspires in his foreign policy. Again, someone like Michelle Flournoy is a terrible choice because she is the embodiment of pursuing those foreign policy decisions that dump an immense amount of resources in those regions and destabilize them, not stabilize them. And those were policy errors that Obama, that we could blame Obama for. Hopefully Biden Harris have learned from those mistakes of that bygone era, and we'll move forward with better policy decisions, from a foreign perspective.
Well, but here's the thing, even just talking about foreign policy for a second. Trump did, like you're saying, Trump didn't do an Arab Spring. Trump didn't invade Iraq or Afghanistan. Just looking at the last two presidents, you could go back further very quickly. He wasn't nearly as bad in a lot of ways as his two predecessors. So while I would agree with you in criticizing the JCPOA, you can look at some of the stuff that we've been doing in Venezuela or the coup in Bolivia. You can look at different ways the United States has been involved. Nevertheless, that's not nearly as bad as what happened under either of his two predecessors. And frankly, you can level moral guilt against either Obama or Bush, or you could level it simply against the military-industrial complex establishment, which they both more or less went along with. Trump is not doing that. Even now when he's going up against Section 230, you can definitely debate whether or not that's the right move here. As we were talking about in headlines earlier, the bargaining chip that he's using is refusing to, he's using to try to get concessions on that, is refusing to sign the Defense National Authorization Act. In other words, refusing to give the military-industrial complex what they want. It seems clear, especially, he had Bolton in, That wasn't a good move. But he's lambasted the dude since he pushed him out, saying that he was a crazy war hawk, et cetera. It seems like, for better and for worse, Trump, in this sort of brash openness, he consistently actually has gone up against the worst inclinations of the military-industrial complex, at least by and large. What's your take on that, Dr. Honigman?
Yeah, I just don't see him as having done anything, positive. Frankly, I mean, the guy has delusions of being some kind of peacemaker, actually, and frankly, it seems like we're closer to nuclear war even than we've ever been. So there seems to be more tension with China at this point as well. And despite this kind of love affair that he has with North Korea, we're still up to our eyeballs in Afghanistan and Iraq. So frankly, no, I don't think that he's been any better on foreign policy. And in fact, I think it's for the most part a ruse.
But the Mil-In complex, just to cut in real quick, they've held him back from withdrawing from Afghanistan. As far as I can tell, for over a year now, it's been one of his primary goals to have us withdraw from Afghanistan. Troop numbers are going down, not to zero, but they're getting cut in half. Many of these places. And as the ambassador to Syria was saying, they were actually lying to Trump, artificially deflating the numbers to try to keep troops there. So his instincts appear to have been to consistently go up against what the military-industrial complex wants. And I'm worried that going into a Biden administration, it's going to swing very far in the opposite direction. And that could potentially, we're talking about the medical crisis in response to COVID. If you have a war, a world war even, that's hundreds of thousands, millions of lives on the line. So I don't mean to get too deep into it. We only have so much time. And I do want to thank you for joining us, Dr. Honigman.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Great conversation. You guys have been listening to the voice of Dr. Bill Honigman, retired emergency room physician, progressive healthcare activist, and national outreach director at progressivedemocratsofamerica.org. You can follow Bill on Twitter at Dr. Bill H, and also check out Progressive Democrats of America at pdamerica.org. We're going into a break. We're going to be taking calls on the other side of this break. The phone number is 202-521-1320. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're taking your calls. Our phone lines are open. 202-521-1320 is the number. We have David calling in from California. David, you are on the line. What's going on?
Hello, Shane and Jamarl. Hey, that last guest, Dr. Honigman, is the very definition of someone blinded by partisanship. First of all, you bring up the Korean War, and he says, I don't see him trying to be anything more than a Russian oligarch. Really? Are you serious?
I was
How
thinking,
blind can a person be?
I was thinking the same thing. I was sitting here thinking the same thing.
Yeah, I hear you on
the
that
Russian
one.
oligarch comment. In fact, I just wrote it in the chat. Look, Bloomberg by himself can basically buy every Russian, quote unquote oligarch. We have our own oligarchs. We don't need to go to Russia to find them. And yeah, I mean, to make the argument that Trump has done nothing right, nothing. Like that's partisanship. I mean, run amok. I agree with you. But go ahead, finish your comment. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, the fact that he pushed back against the military complex, this war machine that we've been under for the past 40 years, this insane, monstrous, war machine, the fact that he pushed back against, and no one else besides Kennedy ever did, should be an illuminating fact. But no, a partisan hack like Honigman will just go, no, Trump is a horrible, evil person. He tried to bring peace to North Korea. Holy crap.
Well, I don't think, just to be fair, I don't think Honigman is a hack.
I don't want to.
Yeah. I don't think he's a hack. I don't want to go there. I just think.
No, he's an old geezer who's too well set in his ways to see the truth, is what he is.
Well, even that, frankly, I enjoyed the conversation, and he's a sweet guy, and we just had him on as a guest. I don't want to be too hard. With the Russian oligarch comment,
disagree with him.
One comment here that I feel is worth bringing up is that if you're gonna look at Biden versus Trump on working with Russian oligarchs, Biden's worse. Biden was the Senate Resolution 322, as my dad, former host of the show, brought up pretty frequently. In 2005, Biden was the sole sponsor for Senate Resolution 322, which is basically expressing support for Mikhail Khodorkovsky, a literal Russian oligarch. Khodorkovsky has become a major sort of international anti-Putin player. Trump didn't do anything like that. So in terms of working with Russian oligarchs, Biden is worse. But even then, it's a kind of off-base criticism, in my opinion, to make. There's a lot more to fear from American oligarchs than Russian oligarchs at this point. I don't know. Jamarl, what's your take?
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, look, we're going to have people on the show who we disagree with. And, in the context of that disagreement, we can do it in a way that doesn't necessarily, let's say, trigger. Sometimes it does. But we try not to go after somebody in a way where it puts the person down or undermines their point of view, even if we completely disagree with the point of view. I want to say the same thing as about Dr. Honigman. He came on the show. We were skeptical of the point of view. We had the argument about it. I don't necessarily want to denigrate the guy after the fact when he leaves. I don't want to call him a hack or anything like that. I'm not using any of that terminology. No. I just disagree with his position. And like I said, if he's nice enough to come on the show, I'm not going to hit him. But clearly I disagree with this position. I'll leave it at that.
100%. Yeah, we both do. But I mean, here's another way to look at it. And this is what part of, different reasons you might not want to call somebody a hacker. You might not want to be that. Frankly, I don't. So I don't see him that way. But also, I don't think it's good for our society if when we confront somebody who has different political opinions than ours, we resort to personal insults. We resort to just, like ad hominem attacks and stuff. I think that's part of this like cycle of retributory, escalatory violence. Even if it's verbal violence, even if all we're doing is just trying to, deny their character, deny their personhood, whatever, attribute bad motivations, say they're incompetent, et cetera, in different ways. I don't think it's good for us. It's not good for our society, but it's also not good because and I don't mean to be too critical here, David. I don't think it's good for our arguments. It's not good for literally our ability to think clearly. If our knee-jerk response is to start insulting people, well, then that means that you don't have something more meaningful or useful to say to them. You just have to talk about them. Anyway, I don't mean to beat this bush too long. We're still taking calls, 202-521-1320. David, thank you for the call. We've got Travis calling in from Arizona. Travis, you're on the line. What's going on?
Good morning. I just wanted to ask if either of you also see a viable strategy to fix one of the key issues with our politics that makes our government non-representative, which is corporate personhood and getting corporate money out of politics. It's something that, we're all aware of, but I seldom hear it discussed, especially in the realm of politics. But do either of you see a viable solution or a strategy to address that?
If you have political will, yes, but you don't, almost by definition, because the political system is a glove for the hand that is corporations. So in an ideal world, there are a bunch of different avenues for tackling that. And if you had some larger process of political reformation in our society and our government, both at the same time, then you could probably make some progress on that. But that's kind of a big if. That's a big hurdle. And frankly, we talk a lot about leadership. Talk a lot about what different reformational movements might look like. Mm-hmm. That's where that comes in. Is that becomes one of those planks, one of those ways to reform our political system. And that's something I think that both the left and the right, specifically the populist left and the populist right and the populist center, could all get behind. That the corporate personhood, the issue of corporate contributions, quote unquote. That's a euphemism, corporate contributions, corporate manipulations of our elections. That's something nobody likes. So, I could see that happening. Jamarl, what's your take?
Corporations are people too, my friend. I can't believe you're trying to say that they're not, Shane. That's the Mitt Romney quote, right? But from the standpoint of law, they actually treat them that way. It's obscene that these things would even be talked about in the same breath as a person. I mean, like, if I open the door for Shane, I'm doing it because I just opened the door for Shane. A corporation will basically charge 2 nickels for doing so. Like, these are not equivalent items. I think it crashes. I don't know how you get out of it other than to crash. And the reason why I say it is if you think about who benefits, who prospers, cui bono, who benefits off this. Well, the people who benefit are basically the politicians, the media, and people who are basically in positions to basically talk to you and give you information and everything else, and people behind the scenes. Basically, the established class that got to where they are benefits from the system the way the system is. So how do you change that when people prosper? I honestly don't know. And I get the feeling that it crashes before it changes. That's, depressing, but it could be true unless you get this reformation and, like you say, a leader. And those things do happen at times. So I don't want to necessarily put it out of the realm of possibility. We have 2 callers. Let's go to Brave from Atlanta. Brave, what's going on, man?
Good morning, guys. I was actually going to, I'm feeling pretty demotivated this morning because the politics is sucking and the people are sucking even worse. I don't fault the politicians because they're garbage and I expect them to be garbage. I just hope for the people to have the will to push back. But it doesn't seem like the people have the will to push back except for a small few, right? So I
told you immediately after the election, Biden Democrats, they assumed that people would be quiet, that the hostility and everything else during this interregnum goes away, and people just kind of shut their mouths. And you might have a quiet few, but ultimately, Democrats themselves go back to sleep. That was the thought, Brave.
And isn't that what the people wanted, though? Like, if you look at, hello?
Oh, great. Go ahead.
Go for it.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut. I didn't mean to cut in over you. It's frustrating because for all of the riling up and the revolution and against Trump, I just feel like it was not about so much that Trump was so bad because I disagree with your last guest. Trump is bad, but Biden and his administration, his selected picks are far worse, right? So I feel like it's not so much that Trump was worse. I just feel like Trump was too loud and people wanted him to shut up so they can go to sleep. So with that being the case, that means the public rose up to silence themselves. And I don't know what to do with that personally. I don't know what to do with that. So I guess I don't know where I'm going with my question. I just know I'm frustrated and demotivated, and I rarely get here. I went through basic training, selections with the military, multiple deployments, and I never lost motivation. I am totally demotivated right now. So if you guys got some wise words, I'd appreciate it. And
I don't know if I have wise words. There's a quote that came up from Antonio Gramsci that I think I brought up a little while back that comes to mind, which is, I'll paraphrase it, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. This idea that despite the fact that the state of affairs can be pretty damn demotivating, can be depressing, and can seem hopeless, nevertheless, there's always something within you that has the capacity to act out of a place of optimism. Even if things seem dreary, you can always act out of that. And for somebody who's not feeling that way, that's not going to mean anything. Another way of looking at this is these things come and go. You're probably an older dude and a wiser dude than I am, so I don't mean to preach too much here. We got another caller. I have Louise calling in from Virginia. Louise, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Yes, Shane, I'm having a knee-jerk reaction, which you don't like because you think we're at a tea party. The previous fellow who called in against Honigman and didn't have anything nice to say about him, oh horrors, was absolutely right. He said the only thing that matters, that needs saying, is to be against the war machine. And I think your callers after that fellow and myself are saying the same thing, more or less.
I think that's what I said. I think that was consistently, in fact, that was like the one point that I brought up when I was talking about the Trump versus Biden thing. I don't mean to take it personally. Again, here's Louise, thank you for the call. Here's why I'm against the hack thing, specifically just the ad hominem attacks. You can say that, but you can say that with more eloquence in a way that's actually going to swing people who disagree with you. And if you fall into just insulting the person, then not only do you drive them away, but you drive anybody who hears kind of what they're saying and is on the borderline. So I get the emotional reaction, but you called in yesterday. We were talking about Yeats's poem, The Second Coming, and that line, the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. I see passionate intensity in insults. And it's not just greed. You said that, it's passionate greed that brings it out. I think there's also just something about this out of control sort of, this irrationality. I think, you partly win in the long run through tactical and strategic thinking, and that includes the conversations that you have. But I don't mean to, you just hung up. I don't mean to talk too much. Jamarl, got a minute left or so. What's your take?
I don't think it's entirely irrational, even though I don't think it's helpful. Look, and to put it in more blunt terms, a gentleman comes on the show. We appreciate him coming on the show. And then once he leaves, within a few minutes, you call the guy a hack. I mean, just from, respect in the standpoint of the show and respect from the standpoint of the people who we bring on and want to bring on, it's a big deal that you disrespect the show and call the guy a hack like that. And even if I agree with your basic point in regards to, politically agree with you from an ideological standpoint, that's still uncalled for, considering the guy just left the show like a minute ago. This is not some random person who you're doing it. This is somebody who is a guest and was nice enough to come on the show. So, Louise, Brave, I agree with all of you guys in regards to the spirited quality of it and the correctness of the point of view. What I disagree with is the attacks. You guys could hear me go after people on my show. And what do I always say? They're welcome to come on to confront me about it. I feel that way because I think there's a certain degree of respect that's owed in these situations. But I have great qualms with attacking guests like that. I just do. I just think it's wrong in principle.
I think, and here's the thing, is we're both saying that after having spent basically the entirety of those two segments disagreeing with the guy, where we were doing nothing but arguing with him. I know that anyway, I know that you guys feel the same way about a lot of this stuff too. We're going into the closing of our show. We'll be back tomorrow. Thank you to producers Cameron and Raheem. Thank you, engineer Andre. Thank you, Jamarl Thomas. Thank you to our guests. And thank you, that is you, for listening this morning. Hope you all have a great day. We will see you again tomorrow.
Another one is in the books, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Enjoy the guests. I want to thank everybody for joining us. Definitely make sure you hit the like button. I think there's a bit of censorship going on there. We're dropping people from the channel by I think one day it was 50. But nevertheless, just make sure you hit the like button. Make sure if you enjoy it, make sure you hit and smash as hard as you possibly can the subscribe button, and make sure you also pop in at all times of the day and night. Look, I want to thank all of you for joining us, man. We try to do the best show that we can, the little engine that could, and I appreciate you guys sticking with us. Not to mention sticking with me. This has been a weird and rough year. So, Steffi G. Jamal, do you support Door idea of, of pushing the 15 squad to downvote Pelosi if no Medicare for all? Yes, they should. I mean, keep in mind, I was the person that believed that you should not vote for a Democrat that is not representing your interests, especially on something as big as Medicare for all. For God's sake, the overwhelming majority of the Democratic Party backs Medicare for all. I'm talking about people, human beings. They back it. You're in the middle of a pandemic with 12 million people ill, 250,000, give or take, that are dead, and the number is going up by thousands every day. The Democratic Party that is supposed to be there to ameliorate the rough edges of our capitalistic system, that is supposed to deal with the rough parts of life, dropped the ball. And on Medicare for all would use it for the politics of it. So you would have the political candidates that were running in the primaries. Each one would say, I'm for Medicare for all. Then you hear Medicare for all with people with bad backs. Medicare for all with people with bad legs. Medicare for all with people with a testicle that went kind of up in their body. We're for Medicare for all for those people. it kept changing. They wanted to use the term Medicare for all, but they didn't necessarily want to implement it entirely. Now, part and parcel to this is the person who did want to implement it was the guy that was not getting money from corporate America, that was not the corporate candidate. That's the guy that wanted to implement it, because the fact of the matter is where your power base is, to some degree, determines the extent of what you can do. And if you're getting power from people who are putting, let's say, giving you $1 billion, and you know that these companies or these people, these executives, they're going to have this kind of expectation, and you yourself are going to want money for the next time you run. You're going to want money or favors for maybe members of your family to go into a particular company or get that particular internship or get that particular job or whatever. It's soft power and hard power that go into individuals getting benefits and bonuses for their cooperation with these companies. It doesn't have to be this formal idea. It can be just understood. I'm making the point that, yes, we need to get to the point of letting them fail. This argument of you have nowhere else to go has been used for the last 40, 50 years to basically curb the left. They're terrified of the Republican. And because they're terrified of the Republican, the Democrat, who will still have $100 million in the bank if Trump wins, that Democrat that gave 95% of the income gains to the top 1%, that Democrat will look you in the eye and say, you have nowhere else to go. And until you get to the point of saying, yes, I do, I could be somewhere other than here, nothing will change. The you have nowhere else to go is the thing. It's the fixture that needs to be broken and needs to be challenged directly. One or two things will happen. Either you get a large contingent of people, let's say 20, 30 million people that say, we're fed up, we're done, this is what we want. The Democratic Party can either accept it or reject it. They can say, we are not going to accept the pretense or the precedent of the public coming together and determining what they want. The public trying to force the political establishment to deal with its wants, to deal with its needs. It can either accept that and appropriate the policy, saying, okay, fair enough, you got us. Or they can say, we're not going to accept it. And they can fail. They can lose. Now, your argument as the left would be, are you telling us that you are willing to tank it to a man you call the apocalypse with legs, as opposed to appropriating a policy with 80% support? Is that where we really are? And fact of the matter is, you could actually be there. They could say, we're not appropriating squat. We're not going to take you talking down to us. And they can take the policy and say, we will prefer to fail. Now, understand what that means. Any notion of a democratic system, any notion of a representative government is out the window. And I would make the argument it's out the window now. When you have the majority of the public wanting Medicare for the all, the majority of the public wanting the elimination of student debt, the majority of the public wanting an expansion of Social Security, and the majority of the public wanting $15 an hour minimum wage, if not more, the majority of the public wanting a Green New Deal and the job programs and everything else that come of it, that's the middle of your country. The politicians and the media, however, are filthy rich. And because they're filthy rich, the people who you see on your television, the people who get talked about for the most part, are also filthy rich. And when they think about the middle of the country, their middle of the country is not those policies because they can afford health care. They don't need the $15 an hour minimum wage because they get bukus more than that. They rub shoulders with these politicians in this kind of worldview of things. They don't need many of the things that we need to get by, the elimination of student debt, the paying for healthcare costs. They don't need that. They can afford that. So that's not their priority. And so when you look at, they hear the center of the country, and they give you this kind of weird nonsense about what's the center. And Medicare for all and none of this stuff is on the page. It's BS. The reality of it is there's a difference between what the public wants and what the public needs versus what the political instrument wants to provide. And they don't want to provide those items that the public wants. This is more so a problem for the Democratic Party because the Democratic Party are the ones that have, or supposedly contains, the left. And yet, The argument that they persistently have to make to the left is that you can't have those things that the overwhelming majority of the public wants. No, you should not back a candidate that is not going to represent your interests. No, if a candidate is not backing Medicare for all, I would go so far as to say you shouldn't even vote for him. Just like I didn't vote for Biden. He wasn't backing Medicare for all, so I wasn't going to back him. And I feel that way about all these candidates. Yes, they need to get to the point where they lose. Yes, they need to get to the point where they fail. And until they get to that point, nothing changes. Your political system will stay as it is. You will continue to wring your hands. Blacks will continue to wring their hands and taken advantage of. Lefties will continue to bitch and moan about the picks and about the policies and about the fact that they're not being listened to. And they fundamentally miss the point that until you get to the point of saying, I am done, there is no reason to listen to you. There is no reason to hear what you're saying. You are basically rationally taken advantage of because they know you're a captured lot. Hence, dealing with that you have nowhere else to go. I'm going to say like, share, and of course, subscribe. Thanks all.